A cartoon drawing shows a large white egg labeled China lying on its side in the middle of a dirt road. The cartoon includes 8 chickens, each with a man's bearded face and wearing clothes. Underneath the egg, getting rolled over, is a chicken wearing a red and white king's hat labeled Russia and a green coat with white trim. To the left, pushing on the egg, is a chicken in orange pants, a blue coat, and a red hat labeled France. Atop the egg there are 2 chickens. The one on the left wears a white military coat and a helmet with a figure on it, labeled Germany, while the one on the right wears a gold and red king's crown with a red coat with white and black trimmed fur. The belly is labeled England. To the bottom right of the egg is another chicken wearing a blue top hat labeled Austria and a red coat, sticking its tongue out at the Russian chicken. A chicken stands in the background on the right wearing red striped white pants and a black coat, a hat labeled with Japan. A chicken that is dressed in a long blue coat, yellow vest and white pants with red stripes and a hat labeled S is perched on a fence in the rear right. A man's head with a black helmet with Italy written on it is peeking out from behind the egg on the left. Grass and trees are in the background. Figure 9-1, a troublesome egg to hatch. Eager for wealth, the powerful industrialized nations of the world try to hatch the troublesome egg. That was China in this 1901 political cartoon by the American artist J.S. Pugh. Britain and Germany settle atop it. Russia is in danger of being crushed beneath, and the United States looks on from afar. Credit: Modification of work, A Troublesome Egg to Hatch by LOC Prints and Photographs Division Library of Congress. Chapter Outline 9.1 The Second Industrial Revolution. 9.2 Motives and Means of Imperialism. 9.3 Colonial Empires. 9.4 Exploitation and Resistance. In the second half of the 19th century, Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, the United States, and a few other countries embarked on the Second Industrial Revolution as they adopted new sources of energy and churned out ever larger numbers of manufactured goods. In their quest for profit and power, the industrialized nations sought access to new markets and inexpensive sources of raw materials. Their desire for resources led them to seize territory in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, ignoring the rights of the people there and costing the lives of millions. Even as large and established a nation as China was not inviolable, and the European nations carved spheres of influence from it just as they did in other regions of the world. Figure 9.1. A timeline is shown. 1811. Muhammad Ali defeats the Mamluks. A painting of a man dressed in long blue robes, a white belt across his middle with a white turban on his head, is shown sitting in front of a window. 1840s. British begin using quinine. 1850s. Mass production of steel begins. A drawing shows rows of buildings and railroad tracks with tall smokestacks blowing smoke. 1850–1864. Taping Rebellion. 1853–1856. Crimean War. 1857–1858. Sepoy Revolt. 1865. Gatling gun patented. A photograph is shown of men with guns on wheels lined up walking next to the guns. 1867. Meiji becomes Emperor of Japan. A picture is shown of an Asian man with a mustache and goatee in a royal military uniform sitting on a sofa with his hat on a table to the left and a sword in his right hand. 1869. Suez Canal completed. 1877. Thomas Edison patents phonograph. A picture is shown of a white dog with black ears looking into a gramophone projecting off of a record player. 1885. Carl Benz builds first Benz motorwagen. A photograph is shown of a 3-wheeled car on a road with just a floor, seat, and crank to steer. 1898. Spanish-American War. Figure 9.2 Timeline. Expansion in the Industrial Age. Credit 1811. Modification of work Modern Egypt. Muhammad Ali by August Cowder, Lighter Colors by Unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1850s. Modification of work Steelworks at Barrow Furnace, 1877, by Unknown University of Strathclyde Project/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1865. Modification of work Gatling in U.S. Army by Yellowstone National Park Collection/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1867. Modification of work Kante Portrait of the Emperor Meiji by Eduardo Chiasson in Tenno Yandai no Shouzo/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1877. Modification of work Photograph of the painting Dog Looking at and Listening to a Phonograph by Francis Béraud in 1898 by Library of Congress. Credit 1885. Modification of work 1885 Bents by Alonso de Mendoza/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. A map of the world is shown. The country of China, located in the southeastern portion of Asia along the China Sea, is highlighted yellow. Figure 9. 3 Locator map. Expansion in the industrial age. Credit. Modification of work World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the technological innovations of the Second Industrial Revolution, describe the spread of industrialization beyond Western and Central Europe and the United States, explain the obstacles to industrialization facing countries in Asia, North Africa, and Latin America in the 19th century. Great Britain was the first nation to enter the Industrial Revolution, beginning to mechanize the production of goods in the 18th century. It was followed by the United States, France, Belgium, and in the first half of the 19th century, by Germany. These nations harnessed the power first of water and then of steam, and began the mass production of goods such as textiles, iron, and steel. Perhaps most significantly, they also manufactured machines that produced parts for other machines, such as spinning jennies and flying shuttles. Developments in transportation and communications technology, especially the locomotive, steamboat, and telegraph, transformed the way their citizens lived, traveled, and worked. Between the middle of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, these nations embarked on a new phase of industrialization. European and U.S. industry was transformed again by new sources of power, technological innovations, new forms of transportation, and growing communications networks. This process is often called the Second Industrial Revolution. At the same time, industrialization began outside the United States and Western and Central Europe, especially in Russia and Japan. The expansion and transformation of technology. Many developments of the Second Industrial Revolution built on or improved earlier technology. Mass production of steel, for example, had begun with the development of the Bessemer process in the 1850s. This innovation removed impurities from molten pig iron, producing stronger steel better suited to building rail lines and machines. Later engineers further improved the process. The open hearth Siemens-Martin process, first developed in Germany in the 1860s, was slower than the Bessemer process, but it produced higher quality steel that was less brittle. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Siemens-Martin process had become the most common way of manufacturing steel. The mass production of steel made possible the great engineering feats of the Second Industrial Revolution, such as the first skyscrapers and the expansion of railroads. Figure 9. 4. An image shows 5 long rows of buildings. Smokestacks project throughout the image, some coming out of the buildings and some standing alone, black smoke pouring out of all of them. The building on the left has some taller sections with a tall tower standing at the forefront. A flag waves at the top. Tall round containers run down the length of the building at the left, with thin long projections coming off of them, leading to triangular-shaped items on the ground. To their right, running all along them, are small smokestacks in a long row with black smoke pouring out. To the right of that, two trains run in opposite directions along train tracks. Four more long buildings are shown at the right. At the forefront of the picture are shown small square objects, a rectangular-shaped building, and various train tracks running in and out of the area. The background shows a river and clouds in the sky. The words "The Iron and Steel Works Barrow" are written across the bottom, figure 9, for a British steelworks. The Second Industrial Revolution was built on steel. Shown here in a British image made before 1877, the Barrow Hematite Steelworks in Lancashire, England, was then the world's largest producer of steel. Credit: Steelworks at Barrow-in-Furness, 1877, by Unknown University of Strathclyde Project/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Improvements in steel manufacturing enabled other innovations. As rust-resistant steel became less expensive, more could be used to manufacture rail lines, making them heavier, stronger, and able to support heavier locomotives pulling heavier loads. Railroads expanded across the United States and Europe, carrying more freight and passengers. Other inventions also made railroads more efficient. The air brake, invented by George Westinghouse in 1869, sent compressed air through a line to enable the train's engineer to apply brakes from the locomotive. Before this, trains had been braked by workers who jumped from one moving car to the next and applied the brakes manually. The method was obviously very dangerous, and if a train car broke free, there was no way of stopping it. Because trains could now be stopped more safely, they could also travel at higher speeds. By the end of the 19th century, railroads had become a common way of transporting people and products over land across distances long and short. Two new modes of transportation vied with railroads for popularity. The first modern bicycle, the safety bicycle, was developed by John Kemp Starley of England in 1885 and sported two wheels of equal size. Unlike earlier bicycles with oversized front wheels that required riders to perch far above the ground, the safety bicycle could be ridden by anyone, including women and children. Developments in rubber production technology also improved the bicycle. The process of vulcanizing rubber, discovered by American inventor Charles Goodyear in 1839, made it stronger and better able to hold its shape under extremes of temperature. Non-vulcanized rubber melts in the heat and shatters in the cold. In 1887, Scottish-born inventor John Boyd Dunlop made a pressurized, air-filled pneumatic tire from vulcanized rubber, just in time for use by bicycle and automobile manufacturers. Although pneumatic tires had been invented earlier, Dunlop's was the first practical tire to be mass-produced, and he patented his invention in 1888. By the 1890s, bicycling had become popular in Europe and the United States, and tens of thousands of people rode daily. Eventually eclipsing both the train and the bicycle in popularity in the United States and Western and Central Europe was the gasoline-fueled automobile, patented by the German Karl Benz in 1886 and marketed beginning in 1888, figure 9. 5. Within a few decades, the automobile had transformed the world as few other inventions have. Cities and suburbs could expand beyond the reach of rail lines, leading city and national governments to raise taxes to pay for new roads. New businesses that sold and repaired cars replaced blacksmiths and stables. City traffic grew noisier and more dangerous, and autos added their exhaust to the emissions of factory smokestacks. The automobile industry also increased the demand for rubber and petroleum, which most industrialized nations needed to import. Even though the United States was initially able to satisfy its petroleum demands with domestic oil, it had to look elsewhere for rubber. An old photograph shows an automobile. It has two tall, thin wheels in the back and one smaller, thin wheel at the front with many very thin spokes on all three. A floor sits high off the ground, and a two-person cushioned seat with a back rail, and side arms sits on that floor. A crank is on the car's right side in front of the seat. There is gadgetry between the seat and the floor. The car is on a road with a building, a wooden fence, and trees shown in the background. Figure 9. 5. The first automobile. This 1885 photo shows the Benz patent motorwagen, the first automobile sold to consumers. It was a few more decades before automobiles came to resemble the cars we drive today. Credit: 1885 Benz, by Alonso de Mendoza / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The automobile's arrival depended on another crucial invention: the internal combustion engine. This engine generates power by burning fuel, often some form of petroleum, in the presence of oxygen in a chamber, to produce a gas whose high pressure exerts force on another component such as a piston, rotor, or turbine blade, causing it to move. Internal combustion engines powered automobiles as well as machinery in small workshops, offering an alternative where steam engines, which were large, could not easily fit. Internal combustion did not become the sole source of energy that powered the second industrial revolution, however. It did not completely replace steam or the horse. Indeed, the steam turbine, invented by Sir Charles Parsons in 1884, provided efficient power for river and ocean-going vessels. Steam was also used to generate electricity, one of the great developments of the second industrial revolution. Burning coal turned water to steam that moved the blades of turbines, which generated electric current. Parsons' steam turbines served this purpose in Britain and the United States. Water power also generated electricity. In 1882, the first world's hydroelectric plant opened in Appleton, Wisconsin. Wind turbines also generated electricity, and in 1911 Italy built a plant to produce electricity from geothermal power. By the end of the century, electricity was the dominant force powering the factories of industrialized nations. Electricity ran machines in factories and lit streets, workplaces, and homes following the invention of the incandescent light bulb by Joseph Swan in Britain in 1878 and Thomas Edison in the United States in 1879. The incandescent bulb's bright light replaced the dim and often odorous illumination of oil and gas lamps that brought the risk of fire and, in the case of gas, of suffocation and explosions. Electric lighting made it possible for factories to operate far into the night. Communications technology improved when the first transatlantic telegraph line between Great Britain and North America was completed in 1858, and by the end of the century, all the world's continents were connected except Antarctica. The telephone, patented by American inventor Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, spread throughout Europe and North America during the same time, greatly easing business communications. In 1901, the Italian engineer Guglielmo Marconi successfully transmitted a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean from Wales to Newfoundland, Canada. He then founded broadcasting stations in Europe and North America and used them to send communications to ships at sea. In the 1920s, once the vacuum tube and the triode had been developed, commercial radio that broadcast news, music, and radio plays became available as well. Other discoveries transformed the factory and the home. Chemical experimentation produced synthetic aniline dyes yielding textile colors more intense and vibrant than those from plant dyes, transforming fashions. Along with combine harvesters, mechanical seeders, and horse-drawn machines that reaped, gathered, and winnowed grain in one operation, chemical fertilizers enabled farmers to grow ever larger crops. Another invention, barbed wire, helped cattle ranchers protect their herds. Refrigerated rail cars were perfected in the 1870s by engineers working for U.S. meat packer Gustavus Swift. The meat and other foods being produced in increasing quantities could now be shipped great distances without spoiling. Link to learning. Manchester was one of the first cities in England to industrialize. The online exhibits of its Science and Industry Museum allow you to dive deep into the history of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Other inventions made office workers more productive. Typewriters and adding machines were common by the 1880s, and New York jeweler Willard Legrand Bundy patented the time clock in 1888. Upon arriving at or leaving work, employees inserted a card in the machine, which stamped it with the exact time and led to the expression, punching the clock. New technology also changed leisure activities. In 1877, Edison patented the phonograph, a machine that could record sound by tracing sound waves with a stylus on a rotating disc or cylinder, and then play it back. Although it had business applications, the phonograph was soon used for entertainment. Phonograph recordings were often combined with the projection of still photographic images to create audiovisual presentations, the forerunners of motion pictures, Figure 9. 6. The black and white image includes 7 different images shown in a collage. In the top left is a table with an early phonograph sitting on top. A man on the left in a suit and striped pants is turning a crank that leads to a long projection going through a barrel and leading to a tube. A man sitting at the table is talking into that tube. Behind him, 2 ladies in dresses and a man in a suit with a large mustache are watching. People behind them are standing and watching what is happening. The image is labeled the phonograph. In the middle top of the drawing, a man in a dark suit, beard, and small round glasses is standing, reading from a long, flowy piece of paper. The image is labeled the address. In the top right, a large table is shown with a L-shaped item with a long projection coming out of the bottom of the L. A man with a beard dressed in a black suit stands at the end of that projection and talks into it. 2 women in dresses and large hats and a man with a beard and suit stand at the top of the L item listening. In the background behind them, 12 men and women in dresses, suits, and hats stand around talking to each other. The drawing is labeled the phonodoscope. In the bottom right, a tall cabinet with drawers is shown. At the left stands a man in a dark suit holding a rectangular-shaped item with lines and circle on it. It has a tube attached to the bottom that runs to an oval-shaped object sitting on the cabinet. A man with a beard in a dark suit and a woman in a dress and a large feathery hat stand behind the cabinet looking at the man. 2 people are shown standing in the background. The image is labeled the siren. In the middle bottom of the drawing, a large rectangular table is shown with 3 primitive microscopes. 3 women in long dresses and large feathery hats lean over the table, observing what is happening. 2 men in dark suits lean over an table, and 1 man sits at the far end looking into a microscope. Many people are in the background talking to each other. Under the drawing are the words "the microscope." To the left of that scene, a man is drawn with a mustache and beard, wearing a dark suit. He holds a stick in his right hand that is pointing to a drawing of 2 glass bottles connected with a tube at the top. He is holding a paper in his left hand. Behind him is a table with various circular items on it, and under the table are the words "liquefaction of oxygen." The drawing in the bottom left shows a man in a black suit sitting at a table, holding an open book. The table has 5 stacked flat rectangular objects on it with 2 wires running from their top to a circular container. Another man holds to his left ear. He is standing next to the seated man. Behind them, 5 men and women stand around and talk with each other. The words "the microphone" are written under the table. The words "Conversazioni of the Royal Society" run along the bottom of the drawing. Figure 9. 6. The first phonograph. Only a year after Thomas Edison patented the phonograph, residents of Melbourne, Australia, flocked to see a demonstration of the new machine, as this wood engraving from an 1878 newspaper shows. Credit: Conversation of the Royal Society of Victoria, by State Library of Victoria / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Photographic technology advanced in the first half of the 19th century. enabling people to permanently record images with a camera. In the late 19th century, a number of people began taking multiple photographs of objects or people in motion and replaying them quickly to give the impression of movement. A patent for a machine to do this was filed by English inventor Wordsworth Donisthorpe in 1876, and a variety of photographers and inventors tried to perfect the process in the following years. The most famous experiment was made in 1878 by English photographer Edward Muybridge, who photographed running horses and replayed the images on a machine he called the Zoopraxiscope. Following the invention of photographic film by New York native George Eastman in 1884, light-sensitive cameras captured images on strips of paper coated with gelatin. In 1887, French inventor Louis Le Prince patented a motion picture camera that relied on photographic film and used it to record the first movie still in existence. A scene, only a few seconds long, of people walking in a garden in England. The age of cinema had been born, but it was some time before recorded sound and moving images were synchronized. Beyond the book, the first action movie. Of all the inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution, movies are likely the most beloved. The French were pioneers in the film industry. Many film historians date cinema's beginning to the first paid public screening by the Cinématographe Lumière, an apparatus developed by brothers Auguste and Louis Lumière that both recorded and projected moving pictures. At this event, held on December 28, 1895, at the Grand Café in central Paris, 10 one-minute films were shown, including La Sortie de l'usine Lumière à Lyon, workers leaving the Lumière factory, Le Repas de Bébé, Baby's Breakfast, and L'arroseur arrosé, The Sprinkler Sprinkled, a comedy about a gardener watering his garden. One of their most successful early films was L'arrivée d'un train en gare de la Ciudad, the arrival of a train at La Ciudad. Only 50 seconds long, it shows a train pulling into the station of a small French town near Marseille. In attendance at the early demonstrations of the cinematograph were engineer and inventor Léon Gaumont and his secretary Alice Guy, who became the world's first female filmmaker, producing more than 400 films at the Gaumont studio. Georges Méliès also attended. His short film Le Voyage dans la Lune, A Trip to the Moon, 1902, is considered the first science fiction movie. At the start of the 20th century, the French company Pathé Frères produced more films than any other company in the world. Thomas Edison was a pioneer in the U.S. film industry, and his studios turned out many silent short films in the early 20th century. One of them was an action picture called The Great Train Robbery that was made by Edwin S. Porter in 1903. Just over 11 minutes long, it was based on a stage play and is one of many early films featuring trains. Why do you think trains were a favorite subject matter in early films? What would people have found most interesting about Porter's movie? Why might Porter have thought a movie about the West would appeal to audiences? Why do you think the film ends with one of the robbers firing at the camera? Link to learning. Watch the short film A Trip to the Moon by Georges Méliès. Its film techniques were considered quite inventive at the time. Industrial frontiers. Until the mid-19th century, industrialization had taken place only in Britain, the United States, France, Germany, and Belgium. By the middle of the century, other countries like Canada, Italy, and Russia had also begun to industrialize. Canada. Industrialization in Canada, then under British rule, began in the 1850s in the population centers of Toronto and Montreal. As in the United States and Britain, early factories produced textiles and metal goods. Brewing and the milling of flour were also industrialized. In the second half of the 19th century, Canadian entrepreneurs began the mass production of steel, established meat packing companies, and invested in the extraction of natural resources such as timber, coal, and oil. In 1867, to facilitate national defense and build a transcontinental railroad, the British Parliament passed the British North American Act, joining its colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the province of Canada, which included Ontario and Quebec, in the Dominion of Canada. The Dominion had the right to govern itself, but it remained within the British Empire with Queen Victoria as its head of state. 2 years later, the Dominion purchased the territory of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company for the railroad. Rupert's Land was inhabited largely by Métis, people of mixed First Nations and French ancestry who were largely French-speaking and Roman Catholic. Fearing the loss of their land and culture under the Dominion's English-speaking Protestant majority, many Métis united under the leadership of Louis Riel to oppose the Canadian government's attempts to survey Rupert's Land. Riel formed a provisional government to negotiate with Canada, demanding protection for Métis' rights, especially the right to establish French-language schools for children. After a brief outbreak of violence, Canada's Parliament granted the Métis 200,000 hectares of land, incorporated into the Dominion as the new province of Manitoba in 1870, Figure 9-7. A map of the Arctic Ocean, Canada, Greenland, and the top portion of the United States is shown. A legend is labeled Provinces of Canada, July 15, 1870, July 20, 1871. On the legend, the color orange indicates provinces, green indicates territories, and gray indicates other countries. Most of Canada, except for a rectangular portion in the southwest labeled British Columbia, Great Britain, is highlighted green and labeled Northwest Territories. A square section at the bottom middle of Canada labeled Manitoba is highlighted orange, as well as a long section along the bottom of Canada on the southeastern edge, including places labeled Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, GB, and Saint Pierre and Miquelon, France. All the other lands shown are highlighted gray. Figure 9-7. The creation of Manitoba. In 1870, Canada's Parliament created the province of Manitoba as a home for the Métis. Credit. Modification of work, Canada Provinces, 1870-1871, by Galbez/Wikimedia Commons, CC BY 25. The Dominion of Canada reached the Pacific in 1871, when British Columbia agreed to join it if a railroad connecting eastern and western Canada were built within 10 years. The Canadian Pacific Railroad, constructed largely by European and Chinese immigrants, was completed in 1885. It enabled the settling of the prairie provinces in the middle of the country and aided Canada's industrialization. Industrialization was also assisted by the national policy, begun in 1878 under Prime Minister John A. Macdonald and lasting until World War II. It imposed taxes on imports, some as high as 20%, to shield Canadian industry from competition by U.S. companies. While the policy did help Canadian businesses grow, residents of the West argued that the tariffs generated wealth for industrialized eastern provinces like Quebec and Ontario, while maintaining artificially high prices for domestic goods in the prairie provinces. Italy industrialized after other Western and Central European nations, such as France and Germany. The fragmented political system of the Italian peninsula before its unification as a single nation, which began in 1861, delayed general industrial development. After unification, completed in 1871, with the incorporation of Rome and Veneto, the government was dominated by northern Italians and invested in northern industries. From the 1890s to the 1910s, steelworks, shipyards, rubber plants, and factories producing canned food, machine tools, chemicals, cement, and automobiles were established north of Rome. Agricultural production in northern provinces such as Emilia-Romagna was also modernized and mechanized, freeing peasants from the land to work in the new factories. The Italian government imposed high tariffs on imported goods to protect northern industry. South of Rome, with the exception of Naples, little industrial development took place. Southern Italy and the island of Sicily remained rural and agricultural. As the north grew wealthier and more urbanized, the south grew poorer and more depopulated as peasants left to seek opportunities abroad. Russia had begun industrializing in the early 19th century, as Russian entrepreneurs imported textile manufacturing equipment from Britain to create cotton cloth. The czars were eager to use new technology to unite their empire and offered cash incentives to European and American business leaders willing to assist. With their help, Russia established steamship lines, and as early as 1820 steamships were regularly traveling the Volga River, Russia's main waterway. By 1851, Moscow was joined by rail with St. Petersburg, the nation's capital and home of the Tsar, figure 9. 8. A drawing of a very primitive train riding on train tracks is shown. The front car of the train is a black semicircle flat on wood over metal wheels with a smokestack and black smoke projecting from the top. A person is seen climbing on it from the side. The second and third cars have canopied open tops with people sitting on the train. The rest of the cars are brown blocks with squares on them. Two of them hold carriages. Three men in long blue coats and caps holding long sticks stand on either side of the railroad ahead of the train. People stand along the tracks on both sides of the train. On the right side of the drawing along the length of the train tracks, many people stand amid piles of wood and in front of a small creek looking at the train. The men wear long coats, pants, and hats, and the women wear long dresses with hats, and one holds a parasol. Among them stand men in military uniforms and two ride horses. In the background there are white and orange buildings and open farmlands. Figure 9. 8. The Russian Railroad. A lithograph from the 1840s shows the first train arriving in Tsarskoye Selo, a small town outside St. Petersburg, in 1837. One of the residences of the Russian royal family was located there. Credit: Tsarskoye Railway watercolor by State Hermitage/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Nevertheless, Russia remained relatively unindustrialized compared to the United States and much of Western and Central Europe. This became apparent when Russia lost the Crimean War in 1856. Despite having a population larger than that of its opponents Britain and France, and despite fighting the war in its own backyard, while the enemy traveled more than 1,000 miles by sea. Britain's and France's steamships provided better transportation than Russia's few roads and railroads did, and their factories produced more and better weapons. Despite its size and the support of its czars, Russia lacked many advantages for industrializing that other countries possessed. It did not have many artisans, and mechanization of production means little in a country without crafts to be mechanized. So long as peasant families were available to plant and harvest crops, there was no pressing need to mechanize agriculture either. Russia's population also consisted of many serfs who, unlike American and British farmers, were bound to the land and could not seek opportunities elsewhere such as in factories. Many Russians found it easier to profit by shipping raw materials such as grain, timber, and hemp to the industrializing nations of Western Europe than to build a manufacturing sector of their own. Finally, Russia's sheer size made industrialization difficult. Its rich natural resources were widely separated and far from the cities in which factories were located. To allow access, thousands of miles of roads and railroad lines needed to be constructed through the dense tracts of uninhabited forests, over raging rivers, and across the frozen tundra that covered much of the country. The United States, which industrialized relatively early, is also large, but not as large as Russia. The workers who laid railroad lines to connect its Atlantic and Pacific coasts worked across easy terrain of largely flat, treeless prairie and plains. In Russia, the few railroad and steamship lines and the few thousand miles of roads constructed before the end of the 19th century were not enough to bring natural resources to factories or manufactured goods to the countryside. Following its defeat in the Crimean War, Russia increased its efforts to industrialize. In 1861, it abolished serfdom, providing potential workers for factories. In the 1890s, Minister of Finance Sergei Witte successfully lobbied for improvements in Russia's railway system, which at the end of the Crimean War had had fewer than 1,000 miles of track. In 1891, the construction of a rail line across Siberia was begun. By 1900, the country had approximately 36,000 miles of track. Soon it became easier to exploit the interior's vast reserves of iron, wood, and coal. However, Russia's late start meant it did not reach the same level of industrialization as Western and Central Europe and the United States until the 20th century. Industrialization conveyed a great advantage. Once a country had begun the process, it was capable of generating even more wealth and building larger, more technologically advanced military forces, which enabled it to gain an advantage over non-industrialized countries. It became nearly impossible for non-industrialized countries to compete with industrialized ones, or even to protect themselves from aggression by their industrialized rivals. Japan proved an exception. Japan. In July 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo, Tokyo Bay at the head of a fleet of 4 gunships, charged with negotiating diplomatic relations and trade agreements with Japan. Japan had largely closed itself off in the 1600s to avoid colonization and domination by Western countries. The Japanese also wished to protect their cultural integrity, and warding off foreign influences was part of this strategy. Intent upon securing entry, Perry ordered his ship's guns to turn toward the shore and fire. The guns fired blanks, but the Japanese military did not know this. Talks between Perry and the Japanese government ensued, and on March 31, 1854, Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa, which opened the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships, promised assistance for American ships and sailors shipwrecked on Japanese coasts, granted American merchants permission to purchase provisions in Japan, and promised peaceful and friendly relations between the United States and Japan. Lacking the military power to resist Perry's demands, the Japanese government had no choice but to agree. Japan was then governed by the Tokugawa shogunate, a system in which a military leader, the shogun, ruled in place of the emperor, whose role had largely been that of a figurehead for hundreds of years. Under the shogunate, aristocratic lords who were subordinate to the shogun, called daimyo, and their retainers, members of a warrior elite called the samurai, governed the country. After Perry's arrival, modernizers in Japan, remembering the American gunboats and China's humbling by Britain's navy in the first of the Opium Wars, 1839–1842, believed the best way to protect their country was to adopt the technology and institutions of the West. They saw the shogunate as a barrier to modernization, so they called for the emperor to resume rule. Many samurai were not convinced by these arguments. Not only would industrialization elevate inferior craftspeople and merchants, who were far below them in the social hierarchy, but the shogunate's end would deprive them of power and influence. In January 1867, Emperor Meiji, figure 99, ascended the throne following the death of his father. In November, the reigning shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu resigned and relinquished his power, and in January 1868, the emperor officially proclaimed the end of the shogunate. The period called the Meiji Restoration was underway. In 1869, the daimyo surrendered their titles and their land to the emperor. Although the daimyo were allowed to remain governors of their former lands, the samurai were no longer their retainers. Instead, they worked for the state. In 1871, the daimyo were removed as governors, and they and the samurai were given yearly stipends. A portrait of a man with a mustache, long pointy goatee, and black hair in a royal military uniform. There are medals on the front of his coat, a sash, and a belt with tassels. He is sitting on an ornate, cushioned sofa with a feathered hat on a draped table to his right and holding a sword in his left hand. His face shows a serious expression. Figure 9. 9 Emperor Mutsuhito Meiji. This highly realistic 1888 Conte crayon portrait of Emperor Meiji by the Italian engraver Edoardo Chiasson was drawn covertly from life and was often mistaken for a photograph at the time. Credit: Conte Portrait of the Emperor Meiji by Edoardo Chiasson in Tenno Yondai no Shouzo / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Even further indignities awaited those who had once held power in Japan, however. The government stipends given to daimyo and samurai were made subject to taxation in 1873, and beginning in 1876, they were distributed in the form of government bonds. The Meiji government officially abolished class distinctions, which for the samurai meant the loss of privileges such as the right to wear swords. Although some rebelled, rising up against government forces several times in the 1870s, they were defeated by Japan's new national army, equipped with modern weapons and trained in Western methods of fighting. Industrialization was a major goal of Japan's Meiji government, and the state played a greater role in it than in most Western countries in the 19th century. The first goal was to build railroads to unite the regions of the country and assist in further industrial development. Construction began in 1870. By 1872, a rail line linked the capital of Tokyo with the port of Yokohama. Perhaps remembering that Perry's demands had been dictated from the deck of a gunboat, the government also invested heavily in shipbuilding. The Mitsubishi Corporation, a private company founded by Samurai Iwasaki Yatori, competed directly with the government and, with its modern ships and efficient management, replaced it as the country's leading shipbuilder and shipper. Seeking independence from Western shipping lines, the government then turned 11 ships over to Mitsubishi with the provision that it establish regular trade with China. In 1887, the company purchased the government-owned shipyard in Nagasaki. Mitsubishi became one of Japan's first zaibatsu, family-owned business conglomerates with financial and industrial branches influential in Japanese politics. Mitsubishi also invested heavily in coal mining. The Japanese government did so too and invested in lead, iron, and copper mines, as well as in factories that manufactured weapons and cement. The government's willingness to fund industries not crucial to military defense or industrial development was variable. The textile industry, for example, relied less heavily on government support. Thus, as Japan strove to build battleships and railways and to modernize its army, textile companies continued to purchase mechanized equipment from abroad. The Japanese government abolished feudalism and gave peasant farmers title to their land, freeing them to sell it and travel to cities for work in factories and shipyards if they wished. Those who remained on the land were helped to increase Japan's food production by the government's importation of fertilizers and farm equipment. The abolition of samurai status freed the warrior elite to use their skills as managers of factories. As the samurai built private wealth, they invested in economic sectors that received less government support. Textile production benefited greatly from this trend, as did brewing and the manufacture of glass and chemicals. Japan established a public school system in 1872. By 1900, attendance was nearly universal for boys, and girls were not far behind. The new system stressed the study of both science and the Confucian classics. Japan also sent students abroad to study technology and institutions in the United States and Europe. By the end of the 19th century, Japan had become capable of competing with larger countries and was eager to do so. It soon got the chance. In 1895, it successfully defeated non-industrialized China in the Sino-Japanese War. In 1905, it defeated Russia and sent a clear message to the United States and Europe that it intended to become a world power. Obstacles to industrialization. As the United States and European nations industrialized, African, Latin American, and Asian nations, with the exception of Japan, did not. This left them at an economic, technological, and military disadvantage compared to the countries of the industrialized world. Historians disagree about the reasons for this great divergence. Some point to the fact that these nations lacked natural resources, such as abundant coal, that European nations possessed. Many note that establishing colonies in the Americas and Asia helped nations like Britain and France acquire capital, resources, and markets that assisted their industrial development. Thus Africa, Asia, and Latin America became parties to unequal treaties forced on them by Europeans bearing deadlier weapons. A contrasting argument is that countries such as Egypt and the Latin American nations realized their strengths lay in producing raw materials for the industrializing nations. Factors such as history, geography, climate, and the nature of their labor forces better suited them to producing agricultural goods or other types of raw materials than to pursuing widespread industrialization. In each nation, a unique set of circumstances influenced the path taken. India. India's industrial endeavors were greatly affected by its relationship with Britain, which had begun trading in India in the 1600s. The 7 Years' War and the subsequent Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, effectively brought French power in India to an end, paving the way for Britain's eventual control of the subcontinent. At this time, India possessed characteristics that seemed to make it an ideal candidate for industrialization. It had large merchant and artisan classes, which produced beautiful textiles highly valued in 16th and 17th century England. India was, in fact, the largest exporter of cotton cloth in the world by the middle of the 18th century. It was also wealthy, and the country's Mughal rulers had maintained ports, roads, and bridges that helped manufacturers and merchants bring goods to market. Britain, however, had no intention of allowing its colony to become its economic rival. Like all colonies, India was meant to enrich Britain, not compete with it. Thus began a process often referred to as deindustrialization, a reduction in a nation's or region's industrial activity. In the early 18th century, even before Britain had forced the French from India, the British Parliament passed the Calico Acts, prohibiting the importation of finished cotton textiles that could compete with the products of English weavers. India thus lost an important market for its goods and a source of revenue. Many weavers lost their jobs, reducing the number of workshops that could be mechanized later in the century. The destruction of the Indian textile industry only accelerated once British textile production became mechanized. Inexpensive mass-produced British cloth flooded Indian markets, underpricing local weavers and driving them out of business. India's economy was not completely destroyed by the British presence, however, and Indian entrepreneurs invested in industrial development. For example, Dwarkanath Tagore, a member of a wealthy Hindu family, founded a bank and purchased hand manufacturing operations. Figure 9. 10. Eager to work with the British, he pooled his money with that of British investors to open India's first coal mine in 1834 and to build sugar refineries and textile factories. Other Indians also invested in such ventures, especially cloth production. Indeed, at the time Britain entered the Second Industrial Revolution, Indian textile factories were successfully competing with British ones selling cloth in China. A drawing of a man with a mustache and big oval eyes. He wears a large brimmed hat on his head that is coiled and striped with hair behind his ears. His dark shirt has white detailed designs around the neck, and down the front and part of a white cloth covers his left shoulder. Figure 9. 10. Dwarkanath Tagore. Indian industrialist Dwarkanath Tagore invested in coal mines and textile factories. He was also a partner in a company that traded opium to China. Credit: Dwarkanath Tagore by unknown / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Ultimately, though, Indian textiles could not compete with British products on price. One part of the Indian economy that Britain did encourage was cash crop agriculture. Small farmers unable to pay British taxes were evicted from their lands, which were combined with others and transformed into cotton plantations. The loss of food-producing land in the late 18th century led to devastating famines that killed some 30 million people. Thus, India was transformed from a manufacturing nation into an export economy, producing primarily raw materials such as cotton, but also tea and sugar for use by the British and opium for the British to sell in China. Egypt. A similar process of deindustrialization took place in Egypt, but their British influence was only one of the reasons. In 1805, Muhammad Ali, an Albanian army commander in the service of the Ottoman Empire, gained control of Egypt with the assistance of Egyptian political and religious leaders, and replaced the viceroy who had governed on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan Selim III. In 1811, Muhammad Ali won Egypt's effective, although not formal, independence from the Ottoman Empire by defeating the Mamluks, the ruling dynasty of formerly enslaved soldiers who had guarded the country for the Ottomans. To reinforce his authority, he adopted the title Khedive of Egypt, a designation above a viceroy and only one step below the reigning sultan. As Egypt's new ruler, Muhammad Ali set out to modernize it. He encouraged the peasantry to grow cotton during the winter months, when they were not growing food crops, and sold the cotton to Britain. He used the profits to modernize Egypt's army, purchase ships for a modern navy, build irrigation systems to grow more cotton, and establish a weapons foundry. He reformed Egypt's educational system, built a military college, and founded a medical college for women. He built paper mills, sugar refineries, and textile factories using imported European machinery and technicians. Under Muhammad Ali's rule, Egyptian landowners prospered. Peasants, however, resented both the forced labor system employed in many construction projects and conscription into the army. Many ran away or deliberately crippled themselves to avoid them. Muhammad Ali also used his army to expand his domains. He seized the western part of the Arabian Peninsula and most of Sudan as well as Crete and Syria, figure 9. 11. Alarmed by his military success, the Ottoman Sultan called upon the European powers for assistance. Faced with a blockade of the Nile by the British and Austrians, Muhammad Ali was forced at the Convention of London in 1840 to reduce his army, dissolve his navy, and give up all the territory he had claimed except Egypt and Sudan. In exchange, he won the right to establish hereditary rule for his family in Egypt. A map of the northeast portion of Africa is shown, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and to the east the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden and Middle East are shown. The map is labeled Egypt under Muhammad Ali Dynasty 1805–1914. A semicircular area labeled Egypt 1805 is highlighted dark green in the northeast, extending from the cities of Alexandria and Cairo at the north down to the city of Arwan. An area highlighted light green and labeled Acquisition under Muhammad Ali until 1840 is shown as a rounded rectangular shape that extends from the dark green portion south, including Khartoum and ending just above Fashada. The peninsula separating the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea is also labeled Acquisition under Muhammad Ali until 1840. A yellow-green U-shaped area is highlighted around the light green area that is labeled Acquisition until 1880. It includes the cities of Al-Fashir to the west, Fashada and Lado to the south, and Massawa on the Red Sea. A small portion on the Horn of Africa is also highlighted yellow-green and includes the cities of Harar and Berbera, as well as an area in the south around the city of Kismayo. An island to the northeast of Africa and a portion of the country of Greece are shown in vertical stripes and labeled Ruled during Greek campaign. A large, long, oval area in Arabia running along the eastern coast of the Red Sea and extending inland is highlighted with slanted stripes and labeled, "Lost in 1841." It includes the cities of Damascus, Diriyah, Medina, Mecca, and Taz. A black dashed line runs around all of the dark green, light green, and yellow-green land running from the city of Alexandria in the north down to the city of Lado in the south, extending a bit out into the west, indicating Egypt and Sudan in 1914. Red arrowed lines on the map indicate campaign with year. A red arrow is shown from the city of Alexandria going north to Greece with the years 1824, 1830. A red arrow from Cairo runs north up to Konya in Turkey in 1831. A red arrow from Cairo heads south along the Red Sea to just south of Mecca in 1813. A red arrow runs from Medina east to Diriyah in 1818, 1838. A red arrow runs from Aswan south to southwest of Khartoum in 1820-1822. A red arrow runs from east of Al-Fashir to just west of it in 1874. Figure 9. 11. Egypt under the rule of Muhammad Ali's family. Under the rule of Muhammad Ali's family, Egypt temporarily extended its power into the Sudan and what are now Saudi Arabia and Syria. Credit, modification of work, Map of Egypt under Muhammad Ali Dynasty in English by Dong Kun. Eric Gaba / Wikimedia Commons, CC by 30. The European powers also interfered with Muhammad Ali's efforts to industrialize. In the 1838 Treaty of Balta Liman with Britain, the Ottoman Empire agreed to abolish monopolies and reduce import taxes on British and French-made goods, making them cheaper than those produced in Egypt. Lacking coal to power steam engines, Egypt's factories also could not rapidly produce enough goods to satisfy Egyptian demand. Although Egypt's manufacturing sector faltered, agriculture boomed, with ready buyers for its sugar and cotton. Needing tax revenues to pay for its military and for foreign imports, the government promoted the growing of cash crops for sale to Europe, and Egypt found itself locked into the role of an export economy. Latin America. The nations of Latin America also became export economies. Now freed from Spanish and Portuguese control, they were eager to industrialize but faced a variety of obstacles. At the beginning of the 19th century, Brazil had imported steam engines and developed facilities for sugar refining, coffee processing, and textile production. Paraguay built an iron foundry and established a steamship line. Chile opened coal mines and built sawmills and flour mills. Many countries also built rail lines. However, they did not become heavily industrialized. Consequently, their development took another path. Ironically, independence was part of the problem. When Spain and Portugal regulated their economies, Latin American merchants had chafed at restrictions. But these regulations had also heavily taxed foreign-made goods, which protected local handicraft industries. Now that merchants could trade with any countries they wished, however, goods made in Europe and the United States flooded in. Like India and Egypt, Latin American countries quickly found their own manufactured goods could not be made or sold as cheaply as imports. They also could not make enough to supply internal demand. As Brazilians and Chileans watched, their silver flowed overseas instead of being spent at home. Latin Americans quickly realized that they would be more successful at continuing to grow sugar and coffee, products that had been the bases of the colonial economy and were still in high demand, than they would be at attempting to compete with foreign manufacturers. Later in the 19th century, Brazil produced rubber for the same reasons, using its abundant land and large agricultural workforce to supply raw materials for industrialized nations. Although these decisions made sense to planters and politicians, they nevertheless locked Spain's and Portugal's former colonies into providing raw materials that did not command as high a price as the finished products made from them. Thus, though Latin Americans sold large amounts of cash crops to the United States and Europe, enriching the planter class, their earnings never exceeded or even equaled what they paid for imports. This disparity had a negative effect on Latin American society. Wealthy plantation owners and urban professionals could afford the factory-made products of other continents, but agricultural laborers could not, accentuating the class divide. Furthermore, many of the industrial improvements that Latin American countries did make, like the construction of mines and railroads, were funded by European and U.S. banks, and much necessary equipment, like steam engines and other machinery, was imported from Europe, leaving little money at home for domestic projects like building roads and telegraph lines. Regional wars in the 19th century also destabilized South America and interfered with industrialization. For example, from 1864 to 1870, Paraguay battled the united forces of Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina in the War of the Triple Alliance. By the time the war ended, it and infectious diseases had killed much of Paraguay's population. Thus, a variety of forces combined to make Latin America's attempts to industrialize largely unsuccessful, and the region remained primarily an exporter of cash crops. Although railroads were built, they tended to be short lines linking the interior to the coast, enabling the export of raw materials. No national rail networks developed like they did in the United States and Europe, and electrification took place only in major cities. China. China also did not become an industrial power in the 19th century, despite its population, wealth, natural resources, and tradition of innovation and invention. Historians have offered a variety of reasons. First, no challengers in East Asia could match China in size, wealth, and military strength, so it had no need to compete with anyone. Second, because China's population was large and often poor, labor was abundant, and employers did not have to offer high wages to attract employees or replace workers with labor-saving machinery. Also, unlike in Europe, most coal deposits in China were located far from population and manufacturing centers. Coal provided the most efficient means of powering steam engines in factories and was crucial to the development of railroads. China had also been weakened by military defeats and internal rebellion. Britain won the First Opium War, 1839–1842, gaining control over Hong Kong and 5 other ports: Guangzhou, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen. In 1844, China also signed treaties with France and the United States, giving them the right to trade in the 5 open ports and build Christian churches in and send missionaries to China. China's loss to Britain in the Second Opium War, 1856–1860, led to the signing of the Treaty of Tianjin, which gave Britain, France, the United States, and Russia further rights to trade and establish diplomatic posts in the capital of Beijing. China refused to honor the treaty, however, and British and French troops invaded Beijing in 1860, looting and burning the imperial Old Summer Palace, figure 912. The subsequent convention of Beijing affirmed the Treaty of Tianjin. A photograph shows a very detailed white stone archway surrounded by collapsed and broken archway pieces. In the back left of the picture are 5 tall broken columns that are richly engraved. Trees run along the background. Figure 9. 12, a casualty of the Opium Wars. Most of the Old Summer Palace, the residence of the Qing emperors, was looted and destroyed by British and French soldiers in October 1860. Treasures they carried off are now in museums around the world. Credit: Old Summer Palace Ruin by Cle 7903/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. China's defeat in the Opium Wars began what the Chinese have called the Century of Humiliation. In accord with the Treaty of Tianjin, 6 million taels, a unit of currency of Chinese silver that might otherwise have been invested in business enterprises, float to the victorious foreigners as compensation for damages sustained. This demonstration of the Qing's military weakness, plus other grievances such as high unemployment and failure to maintain the crucially important Grand Canal, which transported foodstuffs from south to north, led to numerous uprisings and outbreaks of violence directed at the reigning dynasty. Internal rebellion also weakened China. In December 1850, the Taiping Rebellion began when Qing troops tried to force the followers of a man named Hong Ziyuquan from their stronghold in Guangxi province in the south. Hong, a village schoolteacher, had come to believe he was the son of the Christian God and the brother of Jesus. Rejecting both Qing authority and Confucian tradition, he spread his religious teachings throughout southern China and gained a sizable following. In early 1851, after defeating some Qing forces, Hong Ziyuquan proclaimed the Taiping Tianguo, heavenly kingdom of great peace, with himself as king. He urged his followers to give up alcohol and opium and called for the overthrow of the Qing government. His promises of land and wealth for all attracted impoverished peasants, tribal minority groups, bandit gangs, and members of Chinese secret societies, some originally formed to restore the Ming dynasty. Hong Ziyuquan's forces raged through southern China, seizing towns and cities and confiscating food, money, and weapons. Figure 913. In 1853, the populous southern city of Nanjing fell to the Taiping army and became Hong Ziyuquan's capital. Many died in the fighting, and the confiscation of foodstuffs led to famine. By the time the Taiping Rebellion ended after Hong's death in 1864, an estimated 20 to 30 million Chinese had died, and the South, China's most populous region, had been devastated. A map of eastern China, Mongolia, and Russia is shown. Japan, Japanese Korea, Taipei, Formosa, the Sea of Okhotsk, the Sea of Japan, East Sea, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the Philippine Sea are also shown. Inland in eastern China, a triangular portion is highlighted orange indicating Taiping rebel-controlled areas, 1,853, 1,857. A light green long thin area along the Taiwan Strait is highlighted light green indicating Taiping rebel-controlled areas, 1,857, 1,863. Between the two areas in a kidney-shaped area where both colors overlap. At the top of the overlap is the city of Nanjing. Just east, along the coast of the sea, is Shanghai. Figure 913, the Taiping Rebellion. The shading shows the area controlled by the Taiping rebels. Note how close they were to the major port of Shanghai. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the main reasons imperialism grew during the Second Industrial Revolution. Contrast late 19th and early 20th century imperialism with that of earlier periods. Explain how industrial development helped some countries conquer and control others in the second half of the 19th century. Like a chain of falling dominoes, industrial development in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had many consequences, short and long term. To generate profits for themselves and their investors, businesses needed to operate inexpensively and sell as many goods as possible. To keep costs and therefore prices low, they sought inexpensive raw materials. They also wanted markets in which to sell their finished goods, preferably without competing with others. The ships that transported raw materials and finished products required ports where they could refuel and resupply, as did the navies that kept them safe. To the industrial powers, these needs justified their practice of imperialism. That is, the policy of gaining direct or indirect control over parts of the world with low-cost resources and no competing mass-produced goods. Improved forms of transportation, communication, weaponry, and medicine made this control possible. As the industrialized nations came to dominate states in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, taking natural resources and money from them. They sent not only soldiers and administrators, but also missionaries to introduce the inhabitants to Christianity and other aspects of Western culture, often against their will. Raw materials and markets. By the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, new inventions and industrial processes demanded new raw materials, such as petroleum to fuel engines, natural rubber for valves and tires, palm oil for lubricating machinery, copper to conduct heat and electricity, silver for medicine and photography, and lead for pipes. Coal was in demand to transform iron into steel, to produce the gas that heated homes, and to generate the electricity that powered machines and lit streets and buildings. Not all the industrialized nations could produce enough to supply their increased needs. New fashions and tastes also created demand for foreign imports. Middle-class families in Europe and the United States wanted their daughters to play the piano and drove a market in ivory, from which piano keys were once made. The need for quick sources of energy for industrial workers fueled an increased demand for coffee, tea, and sugar. Elites and aspiring members of the middle class filled their homes with furniture of mahogany, rosewood, and ebony. Cotton textiles remained fashionable, but following the abolition of slavery in the United States, cloth manufacturers could no longer depend on an inexpensive supply of raw cotton. The past meets the present. The demand for elephant ivory. In the 19th century, the demand in industrialized nations for pianos, and thus piano keys, hair combs and hairpins, handles for silverware, false teeth, letter openers, billiard balls, and other objects made of ivory employed thousands of people in the United States, especially in the lower Connecticut River Valley. Between 1863 and 1929, one firm alone processed 100,000 elephant tusks, figure 9.14. But the demand for ivory declined at the beginning of the 20th century. Among other changes, radios and phonographs replaced pianos as the chief source of music in the home, and the call for instruments fell. A picture shows men standing and sitting in front of a wall with a small window amid 3 large piles of stacked elephant tusks. 12 of them are African and wear long white shirts, jackets, over cloths tied around their waists. Some are bare-chested and some wear hats or turbans. 2 Caucasian men wear long white coats and pants and have mustaches. 3 pairs of men in the back hold tusks between them while 4 men hold tusks over their shoulders in the front. Some of the tusks are taller than the men. Figure 9.14. The demand for ivory. East African hunters of the 1880s or 1890s posed with the elephant tusks they sold to European buyers. Credit: Ivory Trade, East Africa, 1880s-1890s, by Bassange/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. There is still a demand for elephant ivory today. Although many governments have made the sale of ivory products illegal, people in Asia and the United States continue to purchase them, considering them fashionable or status symbols. Many believe that governments will take steps to prevent the extinction of elephant herds hunted for their tusks, and that purchasing a few small items will not cause serious harm. Demand for ivory has decreased in recent years, but elephant herds in some parts of Africa are still declining, and evidence suggests the animals are evolving to grow smaller tusks. The desire for elephant ivory is not the only consumer demand that threatens to harm the environment. Rainforests are cut to clear more land to raise cattle. The demand for gasoline has also led oil companies to drill beneath the ocean and seek access to protected wilderness areas. Are you aware of other current consumer demands that could have similar effects on the natural environment? What are they? Should we be held more responsible for the harm caused by our demands than the people of the 19th century, given that we are more aware of the consequences for the natural world? Why or why not? The industrializing powers could satisfy their needs for raw materials and markets only by reaching outside their borders to places in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. To amass large profits, however, They needed to extract raw materials at such low prices that it was unlikely Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders would consent to them. In addition, and also unlikely, these nations would have to agree to purchase manufactured goods from their industrialized partners, even though they might be able to produce such things for themselves. Business owners and politicians in industrialized nations thus believed they needed to gain control over these distant countries and rule them as part of an empire. Quite often, military conquest was the means by which they did so. Once these foreign territories were secured, markets established, and funds invested, the imperial powers then needed to prevent encroachment on their possessions by other industrial powers. This led to them to exercise even greater control over their colonies, and often to attempt to conquer neighboring regions. Great Britain, for example, competed with Russia for control of Afghanistan largely to limit Russian access to Britain's prize colony of India. The new colonies were quite different from those that European powers had established in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was not generally expected that large numbers of Europeans would relocate to Africa or Asia and make permanent homes there, and the colonies were not intended to have quite the same relationship to the home country that earlier settler colonies had had. The U.S. treatment of the Philippines and Filipinos was fundamentally different from what North American colonists had experienced from Great Britain, for example. The industrial nations intended to exploit the resources and people of the colonies they established, not settle them. There were some exceptions. The North African colony of Algeria, which France had taken control of in 1830, was incorporated as part of France in 1848. Many French people and other Europeans immigrated to the coastal regions of Algeria and Tunisia with government encouragement in the 19th century. Many Europeans also settled in the British and Dutch colonies in southern Africa. However, this was not the imperial norm, the civilizing mission. On the heels of the soldiers who first opened countries in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific to agents of businesses, came others seeking to bring what industrializing countries thought was valuable. Many from the United States and Europe considered it the duty of citizens from the industrialized, or as they phrased it, the civilized, world to bring the benefits of Western culture to the conquered. According to social Darwinism, a theory then popular in Europe and the United States, some groups of people become stronger and more powerful because they are naturally superior. In this view, those of European ancestry could impose their will on others because they were innately better and their societies more advanced. Jules Ferry, the Prime Minister of France in the early 1880s, stressed that such domination was not only the duty of superior peoples, but also their right. The benefits brought to the colonized typically consisted of religion, education, Western clothing, and character-building sports like soccer. The British also introduced cricket to colonies in Africa and Asia, and baseball came to the Caribbean from the United States. The introduction of these sports was thought to teach people supposedly Western values like fair play, teamwork, and competitiveness. The French called this aspect of imperialism the civilizing mission. Colonizers also typically erected an infrastructure in the lands they controlled, building roads and railroads, and establishing secure water systems and telegraph lines. As the thinking went, people had been conquered not to deprive them of their wealth, but to introduce them to the benefits of civilization through the generosity of the industrialized country. This view no doubt served many as merely a cover for baser motives. Others, however, truly believed that African, Asian, and Pacific Islander societies were being improved by the adoption of the hallmarks of Western civilization, such as Christianity, monogamous marriage, and fashions that covered the entire body. This was the attitude taken by English writer Rudyard Kipling in his pro-imperialist poem, The White Man's Burden. In the first stanza of the poem, written in 1899 in response to the U.S. acquisition of the Philippines, Kipling expresses his belief that it was the white conquerors who suffered at the expense of the conquered people of color, who are portrayed as uncivilized and in need of guidance by people of a biologically and culturally superior race. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness. Unfluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. As Kipling's reference to the half-devil nature of people of color suggests, missionaries played a prominent role in the civilizing mission. They were often the chief means by which the gifts of civilization were brought to people. All the imperial powers except Japan sent missionaries to their new colonies. Roman Catholic clergy had already been converting people in European colonies for hundreds of years. Now Protestant clergy and avid lay volunteers established churches and schools to convert the peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific to Christianity, and teach them the language of the conquering nation. They also took in orphaned or abandoned children and attempted to assimilate them to the home country's culture. Although some missionary activities, like the building of hospitals, may have benefited the indigenous inhabitants, most others were undoubtedly harmful. Shocked by the practice of polygamy, missionaries often demanded that men with multiple wives choose one and divorce the others, who then had to return to their families in shame, or, if they had no family, live without means of support. In China, missionaries' insistence that Christian converts abandon the practice of ancestor veneration often caused the new Christians to be rejected by their families. Many aspects of the civilizing mission, whether carried out by missionaries or government functionaries, were believed to benefit the conquering nation and its citizens as much as to help the savage inhabitants of foreign lands. Telegraph lines enabled communications, and water systems protected city dwellers from diseases like typhoid and cholera. Literate indigenous people trained in European values and customs were employed in colonial bureaucracies and police forces. Although such changes may have eventually benefited the people of the colonized country, they also changed the nature of societies, for example by eliminating traditional jobs, and it was always the case that the colonizing nations benefited the most. Instead of connecting population centers as European railroads did, for instance, railroad lines in places like Africa led only from the interior to the coast, the better to move to waiting ships the raw materials destined for European and U.S. factories linked to learning. Visit this site that features the lyrics to several songs celebrating British imperial might to read and listen to songs of British imperialism. How do these songs represent the British imperial endeavor? How would it have made British people feel to hear them? How might it have made Africans or Indians feel to hear the same lyrics? The means of imperialism. Before either the economic or the cultural goals of the imperialists could be achieved, the desired regions had first to be conquered. One of the first hurdles was the physical difficulty of penetrating the interiors of Africa and Asia. Sub-Saharan Africa was a hot and humid home to microbes unknown to Europeans that sickened both them and their draft animals. Malaria laid low many Europeans who attempted to explore the continent's interior. Malaria was also a significant problem in Britain's colony of India. It was exacerbated by schemes to dig irrigation canals and clear land for railroads, creating more areas for water to collect in breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that carried the disease. Quinine, which comes from the bark of the cinchona tree, had been used to treat malaria for years, and in the 1840s the British discovered that taking it before exposure could prevent people from ever contracting the disease. Cinchona trees grew only in the Andes, however, and there were not enough to meet the European demand. Attempts to plant cinchona trees elsewhere often failed, but by the 1870s the Dutch were successfully growing them in their colony of Indonesia and producing additional quinine, a development that assisted Europeans in their exploitation of the African interior. Besides disease, Difficult terrain and dense brush also made European exploratory and military missions difficult. Following rivers inland was the easiest means of travel. However, most rivers were too shallow for sailing ships, so exploration beyond the coast depended on the development of steamboats. In the 1810s, American explorers began to use steamboats to venture into the interior of North America, exploring the upper reaches of the Mississippi River in 1825, for example, and the British sent steamboats up the Irrawaddy River to conquer Burma, also currently known as Myanmar. Steamboats were also of great use in Africa. The interior of the continent is a high plateau from which rivers pour down and rush to the seacoast. All have waterfalls, making it impossible for large sailing ships to follow them for their full length. By the second half of the 19th century, however, Europeans were regularly plying African waters in steamships much improved over the earliest ones. Besides sturdy iron hulls, the boats had propellers instead of the paddle wheels the original boats had, and steel boilers that were less likely to burst than iron ones. When the boats reached a waterfall, they were disassembled, carried around the falls by African porters, and reassembled to continue down the river. Figure 915. A photograph shows a large two-tiered ship in the water. The bottom floor shows many people standing on the outside of the ship, while the top floor shows wounded soldiers laying on cots stacked atop each other. On top of the ship is a covered long platform with a large circle in the middle and 3 men standing in front of the circle. A white flag with a red cross flies at the front, and a large tall smokestack is shown behind the platform. A cityscape is shown in the background. At the bottom of the photograph are the words Hospital Ship No. 1, bearing sick and wounded from cut, coming alongside the bank of the Tigris at the British lines at Falahia. Figure 915. Steamboats for exploration. Steamships carried people and supplies up the rivers of Africa and Asia, opening these continents to explorers, missionaries, and soldiers. The hospital ship in this early photograph traveled the Tigris River in Iraq. Credit: British hospital ship on the Tigris River carrying wounded in 1916 by E.E. Jones / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Steamships carried not only soldiers, explorers, and traders into the interiors of continents, but also guns. Weapons had improved rapidly in the industrialized world in the 19th century, and guns were another type of technology that gave Europeans a significant advantage. European and U.S. soldiers were armed with breech-loading, repeating rifles and handguns that could be loaded quickly and fired with greater accuracy. Smokeless powder increased the velocity of bullets, and thus the severity of gunshot wounds, and bullets had been rendered more lethal. Dum-dum bullets, named for Dum-dum, the arsenal town in India where they were first used, were flat or hollow bullets that expanded upon impact, increasing the size of the holes they made. Machine guns were also used extensively in colonial warfare. The Gatling gun from the United States could fire 3,000 bullets per minute. Another U.S. invention, the Maxim gun, was a single-barreled weapon, unlike the Gatling gun, that could fire 11 bullets per second. Such weapons could be produced in large numbers only in industrialized nations. Thus, the only way the people of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific could acquire guns was to purchase them, and they were inordinately expensive. A native of the Sudan who wanted to purchase a European or U.S.-made rifle at the end of the 19th century would have to pay at least 5 camels, or, if a European were willing to make the trade, 36 enslaved people. Firearms were less common in Central and South Africa, and people fought with swords and spears into the 19th century. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the places in which the industrialized nations built empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Describe how the industrialized nations built their empires. Explain where and why the world's industrialized nations came into conflict while building their empires. In the later 19th century, The industrialized nations regarded their colonies as necessary sources of wealth and strength. Some, like Britain and France, had already established colonies a century or more before. Now they focused on tightening their control over these and acquiring more. The United States, Germany, and Japan lacked overseas colonies and now sought to acquire them. Africa. The industrialized nations of Europe saw Africa, with its rich natural resources, as the great prize, and they moved quickly to seize it. At the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, Europeans controlled about 10% of the African continent. By the end of the century, after the scramble for Africa, the competition among European countries to establish African colonies, they controlled 90%, with the largest portions ruled by Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany. Portugal and Spain still claimed colonies acquired in the 14th and 15th centuries, figure 916. Two maps of Africa are shown. The map on the left is labeled 1880 and shows portions of the African coast highlighted with different colors. A small area on the northern coast and two small areas on the western coast are highlighted green, indicating France. Two large areas in the north, extending inland, and a small area in the Horn of Africa are highlighted orange, indicating Ottoman. Four very small violet areas are highlighted in the west, and one large area in the south indicate Great Britain. One very small gray area in the southwest, and a long thin area in the southeast indicate Portugal. A purple-pink area is highlighted in the inland south and indicates Boer. The map on the right is labeled 1913 and shows all of Africa highlighted with different colors. A large area in the south, a large area in the northeast, and several areas in the west are highlighted violet throughout Africa to indicate control by Great Britain. Most of West Africa and the island of Madagascar are highlighted green, indicating France. One large area in the middle of Africa is highlighted pink to indicate Belgium. Three areas are highlighted light pink in the southern half of Africa to indicate Germany. Two gray areas in the south, one on the west coast and one of the east coast, indicate Portugal. Three yellow highlighted areas in the northern portions of Africa and the Horn of Africa indicate Italy. Three small areas in the northwest and one small portion on the west coast are highlighted beige, indicating Spain. Two light blue areas in the northern portion of Africa, one on the west coast and one on the Horn of Africa, are highlighted light blue to indicate independent. Figure 9:16 Colonial Africa. The 1880 map shows how much territory was controlled by Europeans at the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution. The 1913 map shows Africa approximately 30 years later. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. European nations aim to colonize the continent to get access to raw materials and new markets for their goods, to boost international prestige and national pride, and to achieve military dominance over rivals. The scramble for Africa reached its height during the Berlin Conference of 1884–1885 when, without input from Africans, European nations simply allotted different parts of the continent to one another. Some agreements were formal recognitions of existing colonies and territories, while others recognized new claims. Colonization continued throughout the 1880s–1910. France had been reluctant to claim colonies in Africa. It controlled the island of Gorée off the coast of Senegal and had a few trading posts in the interior. Beyond expanding into the interior of Senegal in the 1850s, however, it did little until the end of the 19th century, when the European powers met at the 1878 Congress of Berlin to decide the fate of the defeated Ottoman Empire's possessions in North Africa. France received Tunisia. Tunisia had borrowed heavily from European powers to fund development and modernize its army. When it declared bankruptcy in 1869, Britain, France, and Italy established a commission to manage its finances and ensure repayment. At the Congress of Berlin, Italy hoped to gain Tunisia since a number of its citizens now lived there. Britain, however, did not wish Italy to control both sides of the Strait of Sicily, endangering British access to the eastern Mediterranean, but it did want French support for its claims to the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. Germany wished France to focus on North Africa rather than continental Europe, where Germany hoped to increase its own influence. Thus, France was given Tunisia, and Italy received the city of Tripoli in Libya instead. Britain and Germany were content to allow France to claim Tunisia, but the Tunisians refused to acknowledge this grant of power. A Tunisian attack on the French colony of Algeria in 1881 gave France an excuse to invade Tunisia and establish a protectorate over it, a form of control that allowed the Tunisian government under Mohammed III as Sadiq to manage domestic affairs, while France oversaw its defense and its relations with other nations. After realizing Belgium desired neighboring regions in Central Africa, France moved speedily to acquire more colonial holdings. As a result, from 1880 to 1900, many parts of West Africa came under French control, as the Italian-born French naval officer Pierre Sévigné de Brazza traveled the region, negotiating with local rulers and signing treaties on behalf of France. Areas that are now nations or parts of nations quickly became French possessions. The Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, the Republic of the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gabon, Burkina Faso, and Chad. Besides providing markets for manufactured goods, these colonies also produced abundant palm oil, used for lubricating industrial machinery. France also took control of French Somaliland, Djibouti, in East Africa and the island of Madagascar off the East African coast. The French takeover of its African colonies was sometimes peaceful, as when Brazza signed a treaty with the Bait ruler King Elo Makoko in today's Republic of the Congo and Democratic Republic of the Congo. At other times it consisted of brutal conquest. For example, Captain Paul Voulet earned a reputation for cruelty as he marched through French Sudan, modern Niger, on his way to Lake Chad. Voulet's troops looted villages already under French control and raped and killed their inhabitants. Great Britain. South Africa was Britain's first toehold on the continent. In 1806, Britain took formal control over the Dutch Cape Colony, established by Dutch traders in the 17th century. South Africa was intended as a settler colony, and as British immigrants arrived, the Dutch who lived there, called Afrikaners or Boers, were forced ever further inland, north and east, in the Great Trek of 1836. They established two independent republics, the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, and left the Cape Colony to the British. Britain's second area of interest in Africa was Egypt, an excellent source of cotton for its textile mills. The possibility of building a canal across the Isthmus of Suez, which divided Asia from Africa, had intrigued Europeans since the 15th century. Linking the Mediterranean and Red Seas would allow ships to reach the Indian and Pacific Oceans without sailing around the tip of Africa, greatly easing trade with South and East Asia. Now seemed the time to make this dream a reality. In 1854, the French diplomat and business owner Ferdinand de Lesseps approached Saad Pasha, the son of Muhammad Ali, who became ruler of Egypt and Sudan in 1854, for permission to build a canal through Egyptian territory. Lesseps received it, and in 1858 he organized a team from 7 countries to engineer a canal that ships of any nations could use. Construction began in 1859, and the Suez Canal opened to shipping in 1869, figure 9. 17. A drawing shows the Mediterranean Sea at the top with small ships drawn in its lower portion at Port Said. A small opening leads from Port Said to Lake Mensalem, where more boats are drawn in the water. The water is shown running down the middle of the drawing, past the city of Ismailia on the left and Lake Timsah on the right and into Bitter Lake, passing Cairo on the left and going down. The city of Suez is on the left, then the water spills out into the Red Sea at the bottom where more ships are shown in the water. Land with hills and farmland is drawn on either side of the waterway throughout the drawing. Figure 9. 17 Suez Canal. This 1881 illustration from the Young Persons, Cyclopedia of Persons and Places, shows the route of the Suez Canal from Port Said on the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Credit. Modification of work, Suez Canal in the year 1881, by Young Persons Cyclopedia of Persons and Places / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Britain had initially opposed the canal. It threatened British domination over the main water route to Asia, which passed the British Cape Colony, and it made its prized colony of India more accessible and more vulnerable. Britain's attitude changed, however, when Ismail Pasha, who became Khedive or Viceroy of Egypt and Sudan following the death of his uncle Saad Pasha in 1863, found himself deeply in debt to European creditors, which made it possible for European interests to manipulate him. For example, he was forced to establish a dual court system in which accused Europeans were tried by European judges, not Egyptian ones. In 1875, unable to pay his debts, Ismail Pasha sold Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal to Britain. He was also forced to allow British and French officials to manage Egypt's financial affairs. In 1879, an anti-European uprising began in Egypt under the leadership of Colonel Ahmed Urabi. When Ismail Pasha gave in to Urabi's demands to remove the British and French from governmental positions, Britain and France requested that the Ottoman Sultan remove Pasha from power, which the Sultan did, replacing him with his more agreeable son, Tawfik Pasha. Equally unwilling to accept Tawfik as their ruler, however, Urabi's forces continued to fight until 1882, when they were defeated by the British, figure 918. With the conclusion of this Anglo-Egyptian war, Britain assumed control of Egypt and Sudan to protect its financial interests in the region, and Urabi was sent into exile. The image shows a crowd of men of various races, all holding guns, swords, rifles, or other weapons, looking angry, with some fighting. Most wear white military uniforms with a red hat, but two men at the top right of the drawing wear a brown combat uniform and helmet. In the middle, a man riding a horse has his back to the viewer. He is dressed in a white military uniform and red hat, sword in his right hand. One man at the top left stands above the crowd wearing a white military coat with buttons running in rows on his chest, pale blue pants, and a red hat. He holds a sword in his raised right hand. A man in the bottom right of the painting is dressed in black clothes, wears a red hat, and points a small gun with his right hand. A white horse and 3 palm trees are in the brown background. Figure 9. 18 The Anglo-Egyptian War. From 1879 to 1882, Egyptian forces, depicted in this 1882 image from the Illustrated London News, fought to rid their country of European domination and unseat rulers who acceded to European demands. Credit: Anglo-Egyptian War by the Illustrated London News / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. As hostilities between Britain and Urabi's forces were coming to a close, a new threat arose in Sudan, where British control had been weak. In 1881, a religious leader named Mohammed Ahmed called upon the Sudanese to free themselves from Ottoman rule, which meant, in effect, freeing themselves of British-guided Egyptian rule. Mohammed Ahmed began to refer to himself as the Mahdi, a messiah or savior who will appear on earth to revive the practice of true Islam and usher in a period of justice that will last for a few years before the end of the world. Mohammed Ahmed proclaimed a religious crusade against the ruler of Egypt and gathered followers. British efforts to maintain control over Sudan failed, and the Mahdi's followers continued to enforce their control over the region, even after his death in 1885. Belgium. Belgium was one of the smallest industrialized nations, and its legislators did not believe it had the money or force to acquire and maintain colonial possessions. However, Belgium's second king, the constitutional monarch Leopold II, dreamed of establishing an empire in the Congo basin of Central Africa and was not to be dissuaded. The region was relatively unexplored by Europeans and rich in resources like ivory and rubber, and no other European powers claimed it. In 1876, Leopold established the International African Association. Its goal, he claimed, was to civilize the natives of Africa and dispense humanitarian aid. Leopold's noble-sounding statements were lies, however. Although Britain and France were leery of his interest in the Congo, at the Berlin Conference in 1884, he promised he would impose no tariffs on the colony's imports and had in mind only the benefit of the Congolese natives. Control of the Congo thus was given to him. He named it the Congo Free State and ruled it entirely as his own private colony. It did not belong to the nation of Belgium. Although Leopold kept his promise to make it a free trade zone, Europeans there were free to exploit and abuse African laborers in the pursuit of profit. Germany. Germany came late to the scramble for colonies, delayed by a number of factors. Until 1871, it consisted of a variety of German-speaking states and kingdoms in northern and central Europe, none wealthy or powerful enough to establish colonies. Once unified as a country in 1871, it still did not possess the ocean-going navy needed to trade with and defend colonies, and its first chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, in office from 1871 until 1890, initially had no interest in an overseas empire. Bismarck originally believed empire building was a foolish venture that cost more than it returned. But by the 1880s, he had changed his mind, perhaps influenced by German merchants who sought trade and investment opportunities overseas, or by public clamor to increase German prestige through the claiming of colonies. In Africa, Germany staked its claim to regions scattered across the continent that had not already been colonized by France and England, from Togoland, today Togo and part of Ghana and German Cameroon, now parts of Cameroon, Chad, the Central African Republic and Gabon in the west to German Southwest Africa, now Namibia and German East Africa, today Rwanda, Burundi, and parts of Tanzania. Italy. Italy was the last European power to establish colonies in Africa. In 1884, an Italian shipping company bought Assab Bay, a port city on the Red Sea, from a local sultan. In 1886, Italy took control of the Egyptian Red Sea port of Massawa at Britain's urging to prevent France from acquiring more territory in the region. In 1889, Italy claimed Eritrea as a colony. It also signed the Treaty of Wuchil with Menelik II, who became Emperor of Ethiopia that same year. In the Italian-language version of the treaty, Menelik was promised military and financial aid in exchange for control over Eritrea and its foreign affairs. In the Ethiopian-language version, the emperor had the choice of accepting or rejecting Italian control. When, in 1895, Italy insisted on enforcing the terms of the Italian-language treaty, war began. The conflict ended ignominiously for Italy at the 1896 Battle of Adwa, when its troops encountered a much larger Ethiopian force. 6,000 Italians were killed, 3,000 were captured, and others fled the battlefield, leaving 11,000 rifles that the Ethiopians seized. As night fell, Ethiopian peasants fell upon stragglers in the retreat and killed them. Riots broke out in Rome and Naples at the news, and Italians demanded the return of all soldiers and tried to block the troop trains. Adwa largely marked the end of Italy's expansion in Africa. Menelik II allowed Italy to retain control of Eritrea, but the treaty ending the war reaffirmed Ethiopia's independence, figure 919. A very detailed map of the Horn of Africa is shown, with names for countries, cities, rivers, and other locations labeled. Across the top of the map in red letters, it is labeled Carta dei Possedimenti e Zona d'Influenza dell'Italia in Africa. An L-shaped inset at the top right shows a close-up of the Mediterranean Sea and some of the countries surrounding it, also labeled intricately. The bottom left of the map displays a rectangular white box with 9 men's pictures in 2 rows. All are African except for the middle man in the top row, who is European. The men are all shown in richly decorated shirts, with most wearing hats with feathers and jewels. One man is dressed in a plain white shirt and plain white hat. The European man has a mustache and wears a blue military jacket with many colorful medals pinned on his left chest. Names are written underneath their pictures. Figure 9. 19. Italy's claims in Africa. Italy grasped the parts of Africa that lay unclaimed by other European powers. This 1896 map of the Horn of Africa shows Italy's possessions of Italian Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Credit: Possessions Italiens en Afrique 1896 by Bibliothèque Nationale de France / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. European powers in conflict. Although Italy's expansion in Africa was halted, the other great powers continued to extend their influence, sometimes through their private citizens. Entering South Africa's diamond trade as a young man. For example, Cecil Rhodes of Britain established a company called De Beers in 1888 that soon monopolized the diamond market. In 1890, Rhodes became Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. It was Rhodes's goal to expand the British Empire in South Africa. In 1889, the British government gave him a charter that enabled a company he had formed, the British South Africa Company, to sign treaties with local rulers, gain mineral concessions from them, and essentially rule their lands. Rhodes and his agents thus extended British influence northward from the Limpopo River in South Africa, across the Zambezi River to Central Africa, calling the land Rhodesia, now Zambia and Zimbabwe, in 1895. Rhodes's motives were not only to gain personal wealth and power, but also to expand the British presence in Africa and provide room for Anglo-Saxons, whom he considered a superior race, to grow in number. Rhodes was a racist with no respect for Africans. To strengthen British control over Central Africa, where Germany, Belgium, and Portugal also claimed land, he proposed a Cape to Cairo railway connecting Britain's East African colonies, figure 9. 20. This link, he believed, would make it easier to govern the British Empire in Africa and attract more settlers, and the British government agreed. Part A is a drawing of a man standing over Africa, with one foot in southern Africa and the other in northern Africa. He has a small mustache, wears a military combat uniform, has a rifle at his side, and holds a helmet in his right arm. His arms are outstretched so that his hands are above his feet. A string runs from one of his shoes to his hand, then across to the other hand, and then down to the other shoe. A ship is drawn in the background in northern Africa and clouds surround him. Part B is a map of Africa. A slashed red line runs from Alexandria in the north, passing through the cities of Cairo, Aswan, Wadi Halfa, Khartoum, Wau, and Malaba, ending in Mombasa on the east coast of Africa. Another red slashed line runs from Dar es Salaam on the Africa's east coast through the cities of Kapiri Mposhi, Livingstone, Bulawayo, and ending in Cape Town on the southern tip of Africa. A red slashed line also connects the two routes from an area between the cities of Wau and Malab on the first line and the city of Kapiri Mposhi on the second line. Figure 9. 20. Cecil Rhodes. In his caricature of Cecil Rhodes, A., which appeared in the British humor magazine Punch in 1892, artist Edward Linley Sambourne shows him bestriding Africa. Rhodes proposed a railroad connecting Britain's Cape Colony to Egypt in the 1890s. B. Some lines were not completed until the 20th century, and some were never built. Credit A. Modification of work, The Rhodes Colossus by Punch/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Attribution B. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax under CC by 4. 0 license. Several hurdles stood in the way, however. First, in 1891 Germany had established the colony of German East Africa, today's Burundi, Tanzania, and Rwanda, effectively blocking the proposed railway's path. In addition, Portugal objected that it controlled the land between its colonies of Angola and Mozambique, encompassing much of what Rhodes claimed as part of Rhodesia. Britain rejected Portugal's claims, but another obstacle was that Britain did not control Sudan. The modest army did. In 1896, fearing that Sudan might be seized by a competing foreign power, Britain appointed Sir Herbert Kitchener to reclaim it. There was also concern that the modest ruler, Abdullah ibn Muhammad al-Khalifa, might ally with Menelik II to drive Europeans out. That same year, France also dispatched expeditions from both French Somaliland, Djibouti, in East Africa and Senegal in the west to gain control of Sudan. France hoped to lay claim to Sudan in order to build an east-west railway linking its colony of French Somaliland with its West and Central African possessions. As the French marched steadily across the Sahara, Kitchener, with an Egyptian and Sudanese army, moved south along the Nile, establishing railroad lines and reclaiming towns from modest control as he went. Finally, in September 1898, Kitchener and his forces, augmented by British troops, met the modest ruler al-Khalifa at Omdurman and defeated him. Before he could reclaim the rest of Sudan, however, Kitchener was dispatched to the town of Fashoda, where the proposed British and French railroad lines crossed, figure 921. The French had arrived from Senegal some months earlier and claimed the town. As the two armies waited through September and October for instructions from their governments, civilians in both countries loudly proclaimed their nation to be in the right. The British Royal Navy prepared for war. The Fashoda Incident, as it is called, ended when France withdrew its claims, realizing it was outgunned, and the two nations agreed upon a boundary line between their spheres in Africa. A map of Africa is shown. The map is labeled the Fashoda Incident, 1898. A blue arrow indicating Kitchener's route extends from a point along the Nile River south of Cairo, heads north for a small bit, then heads south to the city of Fashoda. A purple arrow, indicating French army's advance, runs from the city of Dakar on the west coast of Africa, eastward across the continent to the city of Fashoda. Another purple arrow runs from the southwestern city of Brazzaville northeast to the city of Fashoda. A purple line runs between the cities of Fashoda and Djibouti on the Gulf of Aden. Figure 9.21, the Fashoda Incident. France and Britain both sought to build railroad lines connecting their African colonies. They nearly went to war when their military forces encountered one another at Fashoda, where the proposed lines were to cross. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax under CC by 4. 0 license. Britain's final effort to exert control over territory in Africa was the Boer War. Tensions between the British Cape Colony and the Boer republics of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal Republic had increased. In 1877, following Britain's announcement that it was annexing the Transvaal Republic, fighting broke out between British and Boer forces in the First Boer War. The British were soundly defeated and forced to recognize the independence of the South African Republic, the new name of the Transvaal Republic. In 1900, following an abortive British raid into the South African Republic, the Boers laid siege to British Cape Colony settlements. In response to Boer guerrilla tactics, the British adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying Boer homes, farms, and livestock to deny them food and shelter. Boer women and children were forced into concentration camps, where nearly 30,000 died from disease or starvation. The war ended in 1902, and the Cape Colony annexed the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. In 1910, the two former Boer republics, the Cape Colony and the British-controlled Natal Colony, came together to form the Union of South Africa. Link to learning. Use the map and slider bar to trace the development of the British Empire over time. You will also find a list of Britain's colonies and the years they were acquired. Asia. Despite Britain's expansion into Africa, India remained its most important overseas territory. India had been a possession of the British East India Company, which directly ruled approximately half of India. In 1857, however, Muslim and Hindu soldiers in the company's employ, known as sepoys, rose in revolt. In 1858, following the British Army's suppression of the revolt, Parliament disbanded the British East India Company and took control of the territory it had ruled. Local rulers whose authority the East India Company acknowledged and who had remained loyal were left in nominal control of their kingdoms, but in reality, they became subservient to Britain. Queen Victoria was officially proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, and the last Mughal emperor, who had not been active in the revolt, was sent into exile. This transfer of power began the period of direct British rule called the British Raj. India supplied Britain's lifeblood, without which it likely could not have maintained the wealth and power that enabled it to assume supremacy over the rest of the world for most of the 19th century. Refusing to impose high tariffs as many industrialized nations did, England was flooded with foreign-made goods that dominated the market. Having converted its economy largely to manufacturing by the mid-19th century, England also depended on trade with other countries for its food supply. As a result, it maintained a negative balance of trade with most of the world. That is, it purchased more from other nations than they purchased from it. This imbalance threatened Britain with economic ruin. India saved Britain from this fate, though at great cost to the Indian people. To reduce Britain's trade imbalances, Indian farmers were forced to grow cash crops such as cotton and tea to maintain British factories and households. High excise taxes were imposed on Indian textiles, making English fabrics cheaper for Indian consumers to buy than those made in their own country. British officials imposed high taxes on the Indian people to pay the British soldiers and officials stationed in India. The tax revenue also went to purchase rails, locomotives, and wire from Britain for railroads and telegraph lines in India. Built primarily to transport British-manufactured goods into the interior for sale and Indian cash crops to the coast for transport to the British Isles, the new infrastructure benefited the colonizers far more than the colonized. British attempts to gain control over regions of Asia, beyond India and Hong Kong, were often frustrated by Russia, which also sought to expand its influence there. The ongoing struggle between the two was called the Great Game. From the 1850s through the 1870s, Russia gained control of kingdoms occupied by Turkic-speaking peoples in Central Asia and incorporated them into its empire as a region called Turkestan. Figure 9. 22. Russia argued that its actions were necessary to civilize the region's inhabitants and protect important trade routes. Britain feared Russia would try to absorb India as well. To protect its prized possession, Britain sought to use the Emirate of Afghanistan as a buffer zone. When its diplomats were refused admission to Afghanistan in 1878, the British Army invaded. Britain emerged victorious, gaining the right to act as a go-between for Afghanistan and Russia. When Russia gained control of much of what is now Turkmenistan in 1881, the two European nations jointly established the boundary line between an independent Afghanistan and Russian territory, ending a serious conflict between the two powers. Part A is a drawing of a man with a long black beard, hunched over with his arms crossed, his feet apart, dressed in a long coat, fur hat, thick belt and tall boots, standing between a bear on the and a lion. The bear has his tongue out and is salivating while standing upright looking at the man, while the lion is looking stern and watching the man as well. The words, "Save me from my friends," is written along the bottom. Part B is a map labeled Turkestan in 1900 and shows the region in Central Asia around the Caspian Sea. India is highlighted pink and covers most of the north and southeast parts of the map. The northern portion is labeled Russian Empire, the eastern portion is labeled Chinese Empire, and the southeastern portion is labeled British Empire. To the right of the Caspian Sea is a dark blue area labeled Transcaspian Oblast. Below that is an area labeled Persia. To the right of the Transcaspian Oblast is a very small area labeled Kivin Khanate, highlighted yellow. Above that is the Aral Sea. Next to that is Turkestan Sirdarya Oblast, highlighted light green, and below that is the Emirate of Bukhara in pink and Samarkand Oblast in dark gray. To the right, highlighted beige, is Fergana Oblast, and to the right of that the Semirachai Oblast is highlighted seafoam green. Figure 9.22 The Great Game. This 1878 cartoon shows the Afghan Emir Sher Ali Khan poised between the competitors Russia and Britain. B. In the middle of the 19th century, Russia added the region it called Turkestan to its empire by conquering Turkic-speaking kingdoms in Central Asia. Credit a modification of work Great Game cartoon from 1878 by Punch/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Attribution B. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax under CC by 4.0 license. Russia also desired to expand control over the far eastern end of its empire, on the Pacific coast. Here, however, it found itself in conflict with a new imperial power, Japan. Lacking many of the raw materials necessary for industrialization, Japan, like other industrialized nations, began to seek them abroad. It first took control of the Ryukyu Islands and also claimed the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin Island, Figure 9.23. Russia, however, also laid claim to these territories, and for a while the two nations shared Sakhalin Island. In 1875, Japan relinquished its claims to the island in exchange for complete control over the Kuril Islands. Two maps are shown. The smaller map at the top right shows the world, with Japan, Korea, and Formosa highlighted in pink. The larger map in the lower left shows the countries of Russia, Manchuria, China, Japan, Korea, Formosa, the Ryukyu Islands north of Formosa, and the Kuril Islands north of Japan. The map is labeled Japanese Empire, 1875–1910. All of Japan is highlighted light pink, indicating Japanese Empire in 1875. All of Korea, the island of Formosa, and half of the island Sakhalin, north of Japan, are highlighted dark pink, indicating acquired lands from 1875–1910. Figure 9.23 Japan's empire. Unlike many European nations, Japan sought colonies closer to home, including the Ryukyu, Kuril, and Sakhalin Islands. Attribution Japanese Empire Map. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax under CC by 4.0 license. Credit World Map. Modification of work Japan Seychelles Locator by Bobumnertiopsis/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Japan's most desired prize was Korea, then a largely isolated tributary state of China. Japan traded with Korea, but in a limited way. In 1873, however, Korea's King Gajong began to consider opening the nation to the outside world. Anxious to gain an advantage, in 1876, Japan sent a gunboat to force Korea to sign the Japan-Korea Treaty of Amity, Gangwa Treaty, before it could make commercial treaties with other nations. Among other provisions, the treaty allowed the Japanese to establish trading ports in addition to the one to which they already had access. It also let Japanese merchants live and work in Korea while subject only to Japanese law. In addition, Korea was declared to no longer be a tributary state of China, Figure 9.24. A photograph shows 7 ships with tall masts in water. They have black hulls and no sails up. A stone breakwater is shown in the foreground and the background shows small hills. Figure 9. 24 opening Korea to trade. Ships from the Japanese Navy sail to Gangwon Island, Korea, in this photograph made in 1876. Soon Japan controlled all of Korea. Credit: modification of work Kenfado Kantai by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. China did not wish to relinquish its control so easily, and a series of uprisings and mutinies in Korea in the 1880s gave it the opportunity to reassert its authority. In 1885, however, both Japan and China agreed to withdraw military forces from the peninsula in 1885. Although this temporarily prevented armed conflict between Japan and China, hostilities between the two soon commenced. In 1894, the pro-Japanese Korean leader Kim Ok-kyun was murdered in Shanghai, and an outraged Japan awaited an opportunity to confront the Chinese. That same year, the Donghak Rebellion swept Korea as disgruntled peasants demanded social reforms, giving China an excuse to dispatch a military force to Korea in violation of its agreement with Japan. Japan in turn sent troops to confront the Chinese, and the First Sino-Japanese War began. Although China had the larger military force by far, Japan's navy was much more modern and defeated the Chinese handily. Humiliated, China signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, which recognized Korea's independence and conceded to Japan territory on the Liaodong Peninsula in Manchuria as well as Taiwan and the Penghu Islands. Japan had now acquired an empire. Japan quickly realized, however, that it would have to defend its gains from its old rival Russia. In 1896, Koreans, angered by the assassination of their pro-Chinese queen by Japanese agents, overthrew the pro-Japanese government then in power. As Japanese influence waned, Russian influence grew, and Russia soon acquired mineral and timber rights in the northern Korean peninsula. Russia also began to encroach upon Japanese territory in Manchuria. Russia's one Pacific port, Vladivostok, was often frozen over. Seeking a harbor that was ice-free year-round, Russia leased land from China on the Liaodong Peninsula in 1897 and built a new port, Port Arthur. A wary Japan offered Russia free rein on the Liaodong Peninsula in exchange for Japan's retaining control over Korea. When Russia refused to compromise, Japan attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in the winter of 1904, beginning the Russo-Japanese War. Once again, Japan emerged victorious over a much larger nation. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, acknowledged Japan's right to Korea and awarded Japan control of southern Manchuria. Japan formally annexed Korea in 1910. As Japan, Russia, and Britain competed for control of Asia, France largely refrained. Its principal interest on the continent of Asia was Indochina, now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In 1858, the Emperor of Vietnam ordered French missionaries in the country to leave. In response, Napoleon III sent gunboats to protect the missionaries and their Christian converts, and forced the emperor to grant France control over 3 southern provinces. When the Vietnamese ruler proved unwilling to abide by the terms, troops returned in 1862, forcing him to concede yet more territory. By 1887, France had established protectorates over the remaining provinces of Vietnam and over Cambodia, a vassal state of the Emperor of Siam, now Thailand. Laos, also Siamese territory, became part of French Indochina after a brief military conflict between Siam and France in 1893. China could do little as Asia was devoured. By the second half of the 19th century, China was a shadow of its former self. Defeat in the Opium Wars of 1839 and 1856 had weakened it, and the peace treaties concluding the Second Opium War had forced it to open additional ports and allow British, French, Russian, and U.S. citizens to travel freely and enjoy the right of extraterritoriality, meaning that while in China they were subject only to the laws of their own countries. China was also forced to allow the practice of Christianity. Alarmed by their nation's inability to defend itself against foreign threats, many Chinese in the 1860s began to call for reform. Among them was Feng Gaifan, a scholar and government official who advocated the adoption of Western military technology and the study of Western science. Military leaders such as Zheng Guofen and Li Hongzheng also supported these reforms. The reformist self-strengthening movement was championed by Prince Gong, who had negotiated with the British and French invaders in 1860. Arsenals to build and house modern weapons and shipyards to construct modern warships were established, Figure 925. Efforts were made to build railroad and telegraph lines and to open iron and coal mines. Although they still clung to traditional Confucian values, the leaders of the movement also advocated educational reform with a new emphasis on mathematics, science, and foreign languages, so foreign books could be translated instead of the Confucian classics. They regarded the self-strengthening movement as a way of saving the Qing dynasty, not undermining it. A photograph shows a tall tower in the middle surrounded by short buildings of various sizes and positioned in various directions throughout the picture. Smoke stacks are dispersed throughout the photo and a large ship is shown in the top right of the photo. Hills are seen in the back left. Figure 925 Fuzhou Arsenal. The Fuzhou Arsenal in Maui was built as part of China's self-strengthening movement. This photograph was taken in about 1880. Credit: Fuzhou Arsenal in Maui by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Efforts to modernize did not go unopposed. Government officials steeped in Confucian learning regarded the new emphasis on science and technology as a threat to their power. Many Chinese were also reluctant to allow foreigners to invest in or own railways or factories. The self-strengthening movement received a serious blow in 1895, with China's defeat by Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War. Critics of the movement questioned why China was trying to change when the changes did not bring the military power reformers had promised. Following China's defeat in 1895, European nations and the United States pushed for even more advantages. France gained control over the provinces of Guizhou, Guangxi, and Yunnan. Britain extended its influence along the Yangtze River Valley. Germany was given control of the Yellow River Valley to the north, as well as the Shandong Peninsula and Jiaozhou Bay. Soon nearly all the industrialized nations had been granted concessions. Enclaves within port cities such as Tianjin and Shanghai, where they exercised the rights of extraterritoriality. In 1900, several of these nations signed a treaty with the Chinese government at the urging of John Hay, the U.S. Secretary of State. The treaty established an open-door policy in which China agreed to trade with all countries on the same terms. In this way, none of the industrialized powers could gain an advantage over the others. In exchange, they promised not to annex any of China's territory. The Pacific, colonization of the Pacific by Europeans, had begun as early as the 16th century when Spain claimed the Philippines. Over the course of the 18th through the early 19th centuries, France and Britain had also laid claim to the islands of the Pacific. Britain established a colony in Australia in 1788 and colonized New Zealand in 1840. France made Tahiti a protectorate in 1842. In the second half of the 19th century, those islands that did not already belong to a great power were quickly absorbed into larger colonial empires. In some cases, competing powers agreed to share possession of large islands or island chains. For example, in 1899, Germany, Britain, and the United States formally agreed to divide the Samoan Islands between Germany, which took control of those now known as Samoa, and the United States, which received those now called American Samoa. In exchange for Britain's forfeiting any claim to the islands, Germany gave it control of some of the territory it had settled in the North Solomon Islands and made concessions regarding its holdings in Africa. The foreign powers took the additional step of abolishing the Samoan monarchy. The United States was particularly active in the Pacific. Unlike the other industrial powers, it had not attempted to claim any parts of Africa or Asia beyond some trading concessions in China. Throughout the later 19th century, it was developing the land and exploiting the resources within its North American borders. It pushed steadily westward from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, acquiring territory by purchase, treaty, or conquest from France, Britain, and Mexico on the way. To clear the land for use by farmers, ranchers, miners, and timber companies. By the end of the century, the federal government had confined the indigenous peoples to reservations. In 1867, it purchased the Russian colony of Alaska. By the 1890s, it had settled all its vast territory and began to look abroad. The United States wanted access to the wealth of China as well as land to grow sugarcane, one of the food commodities it could not produce in a quantity to suit its needs. The United States' first significant move to acquire territory for an empire beyond the North American mainland was to take control of Hawaii. Although it had annexed a number of minor islands in the Pacific, including Baker Island, Howland Island, and Midway Atoll, it had done so only with the intent of collecting guano for fertilizer and did not develop or settle them. People from the United States had visited and lived in the Kingdom of Hawaii since the mid-19th century, and a substantial American community owned land there. Many grew sugar for export to the United States. In 1887, the Hawaiian Patriotic League was founded. Consisting primarily of American members, the League forced Hawaii's King Kalakaua to adopt a new constitution that disenfranchised many indigenous Hawaiians while giving property-owning U.S. citizens the right to vote and hold public office. In 1890, a new tariff passed by the U.S. Congress increased taxes on foreign sugar, which raised the price of Hawaiian sugar and threatened the profits of American plantation owners. However, if Hawaii were to be annexed by the United States, its sugar would no longer be taxed as a foreign import, giving an advantage to the planters. When Kalakaua died in 1891, his sister Liliuokalani inherited the throne, figure 9. 26. Resenting U.S. interference in Hawaii's government, she proposed a new constitution to restore voting rights to many native Hawaiians while denying them to American and European residents. Fearful of losing political power in Hawaii and the hope of annexation, in 1893, a group of primarily American conspirators forced Liliuokalani to abdicate. In 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii. A woman is shown in a black and white photograph. She is wearing a low-cut beaded dark dress with lacy cap sleeves. A brooch hangs from a beaded ribbon around her neck. Her hair is up, adorned with a butterfly pin, and she wears earrings, rings, and bracelets. A white sash runs from her right shoulder and ends at her left waist with a circular ornament. She holds white gloves in her hands and leans on a cane. In the left of the picture is a table with a round, carved vase filled with flowers. The wall behind her is decorated with leaves and plants. Figure 9. 26. Crown Princess Liliuokalani. While still a princess, Liliuokalani of Hawaii attended the courts of other royal families around the world. For example, in 1887, when this photo was made, she traveled to London to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Credit, modification of work, Liliuokalani in London by Hawaii State Archives / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The annexation of Hawaii was not the only imperial conquest of the United States in 1898. In 1895, the inhabitants of Cuba, one of Spain's few remaining colonies, had risen to demand independence. U.S. businesses had invested heavily in Cuba, and many traded with the Spanish colony. The Cuban revolutionaries appealed for help in winning independence, but U.S. President Grover Cleveland was intent on neutrality. When riots in Havana threatened U.S. lives and property in December 1897, however, President William McKinley dispatched the battleship USS Maine to protect them. In February 1898, an explosion on the ship was blamed on a Spanish mine. With newspapers and the public calling for the U.S. government to remember the Maine and avenge the loss of U.S. lives, Congress declared war on Spain on April 25, 1898. 2 days later, U.S. Commodore George Dewey sailed from Hong Kong to the Philippines, another Spanish colony. Entering Manila Bay, Dewey quickly destroyed the Spanish fleet. The war in Cuba also proceeded swiftly and in favor of the United States. Spain's last two island colonies, Guam and Puerto Rico, surrendered with little fighting. In December 1898, Spain recognized Cuba's independence, ceded Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and allowed the United States to purchase the Philippines. Spain was finished as a colonial power, but the United States was just beginning. Not all in the United States favored making the Philippines a U.S. territory, but many did. The Philippines' proximity to China attracted those who sought to trade with the latter. Many feared Japan or a European power like Germany would seize control of the islands if the United States did not stake its claim to them. Indeed, Germany attempted to establish a base in the Philippines only a few weeks after the Spanish forces surrendered. Dueling voices. The future of the Philippines. While Filipinos fought U.S. troops for their country's independence, those at home debated the island's fate. Senator Albert Beveridge Aryan argued in 1901 that the United States must retain control of the islands. The preceding year, members of the Negro National Democratic League had spoken out against annexation. As you read the following excerpts, ask yourself why Beveridge was so eager for the United States to own the Philippines, and why members of the Negro National Democratic League opposed annexation so strongly. Mr. President, the times call for candor. The Philippines are ours forever, territory belonging to the United States, as the Constitution calls them. And just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not repudiate our duty in the archipelago. We will not abandon our opportunity in the Orient. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race, trustee, under God, of the civilization of the world. And we will move forward to our work, not howling out regrets like slaves whipped to their burdens, but with gratitude for a task worthy of our strength, and thanksgiving to Almighty God that He has marked us as His chosen people, henceforth to lead in the regeneration of the world. This island empire is the last land left in all the oceans. If it should prove a mistake to abandon it, the blunder once made would be irretrievable. Our largest trade henceforth must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. More and more Europe will manufacture the most it needs, secure from its colonies the most it consumes. Where shall we turn for consumers of our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. The Philippines give us a base at the door of all the East. Sen. Albert Beveridge, A Speech to the 56th Congress, January 1900. We hold that the policy known as imperialism is hostile to liberty and leans toward the destruction of government by the people themselves. We insist that the subjugation of any people is criminal aggression and is a pronounced departure from the first principles taught and declared by Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and all the great statesmen who have guided the country through as many dangers of the past. Whether the people who will be affected by such policy be or consider themselves Negroes, nor yet because the majority of them are black, is of but little moment. They are by nature entitled to liberty and freedom. We being an oppressed people, to use the words of Daniel O'Connell, should be the loudest in our protestations against the oppression of others. It may be that our government can and will govern the people of the Philippines and Puerto Rico better than they can govern themselves. But with equal force can it be said that the white men of the South can govern the localities in which the Negro is a majority better than they can govern themselves. And if we are prepared to support an administration that is engaged in suppressing liberty and freedom in our so-called possessions, why not be consistent and cease to complain of the same thing being done in any part of our own land? A nation cannot oppress a people without the borders of the country, without sooner or later introducing some such oppression within its borders. Negro National Democratic League, addressed to the public, July 1900. What are Beveridge's chief concerns? How does he justify U.S. control over the Philippines? Why does the Negro National Democratic League oppose annexation? What parallels do its members draw? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the imperial powers, treatment of their colonies, explain how colonized people were harmed by imperialism, explain how colonized people resisted control by the imperial powers. The primary motivation of the imperial powers in acquiring colonies was economic, and in the name of profit, they frequently brutalized and exploited native populations. Even when they believed their intentions were benevolent and would improve the lives of Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders, their means were often cruel. As colonial powers stripped wealth from the lands they exploited, often causing significant environmental damage and destroying countless lives, the residents did not peacefully accept the loss of their independence. Brutality and exploitation. While all the great powers were capable of brutality, and people were exploited in all the colonies, King Leopold II's subjects in the Congo Free State suffered in ways that have become infamous. Despite his claims that his interest in Africa lay solely in a desire to improve people's lives, in reality, Leopold was a cruel master. The Congo Free State was considered his personal possession and thus immune from intervention by the Belgian government. Leopold extracted wealth from it by leasing portions to private companies and individuals. Without adopting even a veneer of benevolence, these intermediaries brutalized the peoples of the Congo from the moment they arrived. Disembarking from steamboats that brought them up the Congo River, Europeans seized Africans and forced them to carry their numerous possessions inland. At times, several hundred would be conscripted to carry a boat's cargo, marching single file with iron collars around their necks, attached to chains to ensure they did not run away. Europeans used Africans in the Congo Free State for all forms of labor, but primarily to gather ivory and harvest rubber from wild rubber tree vines. The amount of rubber they were required to collect each day was so large that, instead of tapping the rubber-bearing vines and letting the liquid flow into pails, they chopped through the vines and allowed the liquid latex to cover their bodies. At the end of the day, the hardened rubber had to be scraped from their skin. For this work, they received low pay if any, often only the food they were given. Entire villages could be emptied of men forced into service, their wives and children held hostage to ensure their compliance. The ill and injured were left to die, and those who were uncooperative or slow were whipped, sometimes to unconsciousness or even death. Discipline was maintained by the Force Publique, an indigenous army commanded by European officers. This army killed those who resisted forced labor or tried to run away, and then cut a hand from each victim to maintain a tally of the dead. If the quota set by officers was not met, hands were chopped from the living to make up the number. People who failed to gather enough rubber could also lose their hands, figure 9.27. A photograph shows 9 African American children and adults in 3 rows of 3. 8 of them wear only a cloth, either across their waist or higher on their chest, while one in the left bottom corner wears a wild-striped shirt. All of them are shown with one hand cut off. The backgrounds of the pictures show fields, straw huts, and wooden fences. Figure 9.27. Colonial discipline in the Congo Free State. These photos from about 1900 to 1905 show civilian children and adults mutilated by Free State authorities acting for Belgian King Leopold II. Credit, Mutilated Congolese Children and Adults by Alice Seeley Harris / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1899, Joseph Conrad published his novella Heart of Darkness, based on what he had seen in the Congo Free State. The book elicited cries for intervention among the British, and following a British official's detailed report, the Congo Reform Association, CRA, was founded. Many prominent British and American thinkers were members, and they pressured governments to end the suffering of the Congolese people. In 1908, the Belgian Parliament took the Congo from Leopold II, renamed it the Belgian Congo, and assumed authority over it. Although the Congo Free State became notorious for the brutal treatment its people suffered, it differed from most other colonies largely in degree, not in kind. Forced laborers toiled in Egypt to build portions of the Suez Canal. In Portugal's African colonies, people were made to grow rice and cotton and sell it to government agents at prices the government set. Where Europeans ruled through local leaders, such as in France's West African colonies, forced labor might be disguised as a form of traditional communal labor ordered by a village head or chief. Imperialism harmed the people of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands in other ways as well. European and U.S. visitors in the late 19th century often brought infectious diseases. The introduction of measles to Fiji in 1875 resulted in the death of approximately 1/4 of the population. Modern methods of travel further spread disease. Railroads built to move goods and raw materials in India helped spark outbreaks of cholera, smallpox, and bubonic plague. The demand of textile producers for cotton resulted in the digging of irrigation canals in places like Egypt, which provided ideal breeding environments for malaria-bearing mosquitoes. Colonizers also brought the cattle disease rinderpest with them wherever they went. Rinderpest came to the Philippines from the United States, for example, swiftly killing the draft animals of Filipino farmers and making it harder for them to grow adequate amounts of food. Once the domestic cattle had died, the mosquitoes turned to biting humans and sickening them with malaria. The introduction of rinderpest-infected cattle to the Horn of Africa by Italians afflicted herds throughout the eastern and southern part of the continent. With herds diminished, thornbush shrubs flourished, providing a perfect home for the tsetse flies that carried sleeping sickness. Farmers often devoted so much land to cash crops that they were unable to raise enough food to feed themselves. People who mined ore or gathered ivory or rubber for Europeans also did not have time to grow crops to feed themselves. Thus people became dependent on food sold by European and American overseers that was often highly processed and lacked nutrients, such as white flour and white rice, leading many to suffer from dietary deficiency diseases. Exploitation also occurred in other ways. In the United States, Wild West shows hired Native Americans to reenact battle scenes for crowds of paying white customers. Carnival barkers often placed Native Americans, Inuit, and Filipino islanders on display for others to look at. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair featured Filipino tribespeople living in recreations of their native villages. Such human zoos of tribal peoples from Africa, Asia, the Arctic, and the Pacific were not uncommon in European cities and in other World's Fairs. Link to learning. The 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri, included exhibits of tribal peoples. You can watch a 55-minute documentary called Human Zoos to learn more about this imperialist phenomenon. Given the harm colonization caused, it is worth asking why native peoples ever cooperated with foreign imperialists. Of course, some did so for fear of the consequences of refusing. Some, however, worked with the imperial powers to gain advantages for themselves and their families. For those who learned to speak the language of the imperial power and acquired a certain level of education, jobs were available at the lower levels of government bureaucracies. People could also serve as soldiers and police, a benefit for members of minority tribal groups that had been dominated by more powerful ones. Others could secure jobs as interpreters or guides, and wealthier ones might enter into business with the imperial power, as did some Indians, Chinese, and Vietnamese. Imperial powers like Britain and France often provided education for the children of those who assisted them, preparing them for a possible job in the colonial bureaucracy, and even a university education in London or Paris. Finally, many converts to Christianity were sincere in their beliefs, and may have felt they had more in common with European fellow Christians than with non-Christian peers. Resistance and revolution. Resistance movements and outright revolts sprang up wherever colonizers went. The revolt by Egyptians unwilling to submit to European control, the war waged by the Mahdi's army, and Ethiopia's war with Italy were all examples of African acts of resistance. Elsewhere in Africa, more limited revolts took place, such as the Zulu and Matabele and Ndebele tribes, resistance of British or Dutch control in the south. In their own words, an African king fights the Boers. King Mashushu I of the Basuto Kingdom of Southern Africa hoped to avert violence between his subjects and European settlers. Figure 9. 28. However, when Boers attacked Basuto settlements, Mashushu went to war. In 1858, his soldiers defeated the Boers, but in two subsequent wars Mashushu lost territory to the Boers. Finally, in 1868, the Kingdom of Basuto was made the British Protectorate of Basutoland, today's Lesotho, and the Boer attacks ended. Following, in a letter to Sir George Grey, governor of Britain's Cape Colony, Mashushu describes his reasons for going to war in 1858. A photo shows two men sitting in chairs. The one on the left wears a flowy cape, a simple hat on his head, and holds a long stick. The man to the right wears a coat, pants, top hat, a long cape coat, and holds a long cane. Behind them stand four men in long coats and pants, the one on the far left wearing a white large hat while the other three wear smaller dark caps. Figure 9. 28. King Mashushu. King Mashushu I of Basutoland, seated in the middle, poses with his government ministers and advisors in this undated 19th century photograph. Credit: King Mashushu of the Basotho with his ministers by Bensusan Museum, Johannesburg/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. I had given orders that no farm should be burnt, and my orders were obeyed till my people saw village after village burnt off, and the corn destroyed. They then carried destruction among the enemy's homes. On coming to my mountain, the Boers found I was prepared to check their progress, and they consequently retired. My intention was then to have followed them up, and to have shown them that my people could also carry on offensive operations, believing that having once experienced the horrors of war in their midst, I should not soon be troubled by them again. My bands were getting ready to make a descent upon them, when the Boers thought proper to make request for a cessation of hostilities. I knew what misery I should bring upon the country by leaving the Basutos to ravage the Boer places, and therefore I have agreed to the proposal of Mr. J. P. Hoffman. I cannot say that I do so with the consent of my people, for many of those who suffered by the enemy were anxious to recover their losses. If they have remained quiet, it has been owing to my persuasions and my promises that they might have good hope of justice, Your Excellency having consented to act as arbitrator between the Boers and Basutos. Mashushu I, Letter to Sir George Grey, 1858. What explanation does Mashushu give for the attack on the Boers? What indication does he give that more conflict will take place in the future? Do you believe he was correct that attacking their settlements would have convinced the Boers to leave the Basuto in peace? Why or why not? Resistance to foreign rule also took place in Asia and the Pacific. By the end of the 19th century, Chinese people's resentment against foreigners in their land was high. The sale of foreign manufactured goods had hurt many Chinese artisans. The imperialists' building of railroads and bridges had put many porters, cart drivers, and farriers out of work. Foreigners were not subject to Chinese law. Protestant and Catholic missionaries in the country were especially resented. They interfered with rituals for venerating ancestors, and families were sometimes split when some members became Christians and others did not. Rumors abounded concerning the missionaries' orphanages. One story, no doubt influenced by foreigners' interest in taking photographs, said missionaries took children in only to kill them and used their eyeballs to make the substance that captured images on photographic plates. In northern China, anti-foreign sentiments led to the formation of a secret society known as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Foreigners who witnessed the ritual exercises that members believed made them invulnerable to bullets called them boxers. In 1899, the Boxers began their campaign to drive foreigners from China by killing 2 German priests. Violence swept through northern China as the Boxer uprising flared. Boxers murdered foreigners and Chinese Christians and destroyed foreign property, sometimes disrupting railroads by pulling the steel rails from the ground. At first, the Chinese army tried to stop the Boxers. However, in January 1900, believing foreign forces had invaded China to stop the uprising, the Dowager Empress Cixi proclaimed the Boxers should not be treated like criminals. Figure 929. Terrified foreigners streamed into Beijing seeking protection, but Cixi encouraged them to leave. Fearing for their lives, they barricaded themselves inside the embassies in the foreign quarter of Beijing. Cixi then proclaimed her allegiance to the Boxers and declared war on foreigners within China. A photo of a woman with a very pale, white face. She wears a long dress decorated with yellow stenciled circles and ornate stitching with very large, flowy sleeves with tassels on the ends. She wears a gold-decorated black hat on her head and large earrings. The background shows large flowers. Figure 9. 29 Empress Cixi. Cixi, once a concubine of the Xianfeng Emperor, assumed power upon his death in 1861. She ruled on behalf of her young son and remained in power even after he came of age. Credit: The Cixi Imperial Dowager Empress by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Swiftly Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Japan, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the 8-Nation Alliance, and their troops raced to Beijing. Waiting for help, the foreigners rationed their food and huddled in fear. One woman recalled hearing frenzied Boxers trying to dig through the building's wall to reach the people inside. After a siege of 55 days, the international force arrived and the Boxers were dispersed, killed, or captured. In September 1901, the Boxer Protocol was signed, officially ending the incident. China was forbidden to import weapons for 2 years, and foreign legations were given the right to keep troops of their own nation for their defense. China also awarded $330 million to the members of the 8-Nation Alliance. U.S. attempts to rule the Philippines after purchasing it from Spain were hindered by the resistance of many Filipino tribes. Middle-class Filipinos had sought independence from Spanish control, just as the Cubans had. Following Spain's defeat, leaders of the independence movement like Emilio Aguinaldo had expected the United States to allow them to rule themselves. When President William McKinley announced in 1898 that the United States intended to govern the islands until the Filipinos were judged capable of ruling themselves, Aguinaldo objected. My relations with the United States did not bring me to make war on the Spaniards for their benefit, but for the purpose of our own liberty and independence. The United States did not intend to relinquish control of its newly claimed territory, however, and war broke out. Attempts by the Filipinos to defeat U.S. forces in conventional warfare failed, so they adopted guerrilla tactics. Both sides tortured captives. U.S. soldiers burned villages to weaken civilians and guerrilla fighters alike and built concentration camps to hold resisting Filipinos. Many starved or died from infectious disease. In 1900, the United States began a policy of attraction by promising economic development along with a degree of self-government. The policy drew the support of wealthy and middle-class Filipinos and others who did not support Aguinaldo's tactics. In 1901, Aguinaldo was captured, and the United States declared the war over in 1903. It was several decades before the Philippines gained independence. India's response to British imperialism was somewhat different. Violence had failed in the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, and middle-class Indians, especially those with a British-style education, now turned to political change. They were disappointed, however, because many British elites considered Indians unfit for self-government, and they feared losing control of their most valuable colony. In 1885, moderate nationalists founded the Indian National Congress, INC, aimed at enacting political reform. The INC especially wished to end unfair taxation and remove all British-imposed barriers to industrialization in India. In their own words, the detriments of British rule, a moderate member of the Parsi religious minority, and sometimes called the Grand Old Man of India, Dadabhai Naoroji, figure 9. 30, was a merchant, political leader and language professor at University College London. A founder of the Indian National Congress, he expressed the opinions of many middle-class Indians in 1871 when he wrote on the subject of the benefits and detriments of British rule of India. The following excerpt outlines the detriments: a portrait of a man with a long white beard and small round glasses. He wears a long black shirt and has a dark tall turban on his head. Figure 9. 30 Dadabhai Naoroji. Dadabhai Naoroji, photographed in 1889, was elected president of the Indian National Congress 3 times and represented the Liberal Party in the British House of Commons. Credit: Dadabhai Naoroji, 1889, The Grand Old Man of India, by Saurabh Jehangir / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In the cause of humanity, nothing, everything therefore, is in your favor under this heading. In the cause of civilization, as I have said already, there has been a failure to do as much as might have been done, but I put nothing to the debit. Much has been done, though, politically. Repeated breach of pledges to give the natives a fair and reasonable share in the higher administration of their own country, which has much shaken confidence in the good faith of the British word. Political aspirations and the legitimate claim to have a reasonable voice in the legislation, and the imposition and disbursement of taxes, met to a very slight degree, thus treating the natives of India not as British subjects, in whom representation is a birthright. Consequent on the above, an utter disregard of the feelings and views of the natives, the great moral evil of the drain of wisdom and practical administration, leaving none to guide the rising generation. Financially, all attention is engrossed in devising new modes of taxation, without any adequate effort to increase the means of the people to pay, and the consequent vexation and oppressiveness of the taxes imposed, imperial and local. Inequitable financial relations between England and India, i.e., the political debt, clapped on India's shoulders, and all home charges also. To sum up the whole, the British rule has been, morally, a great blessing. Politically, peace and order on one hand, blunders on the other. Materially, impoverishment, relieved as far as the railway and other loans go. The natives call the British system Sakar Kai Churi, the knife of sugar. That is to say, there is no oppression, it is all smooth and sweet, but it is the knife, notwithstanding. I mention this that you should know these feelings. Our great misfortune is that you do not know our wants. When you will know our real wishes, I have not the least doubt that you would do justice. The genius and spirit of the British people is fair play and justice. Dadabhai Naoroji, the benefits of British rule. What changes did Naoroji want the British to make? If Naoroji had been a peasant farmer instead of an educated member of the middle class, do you think his criticisms would have been different? Why or why not? Why do you think Naoroji included the last 2 sentences? The moderate approach did not suit all Indian nationalists, however. Bal Gangadhar Tilak called for immediate independence from Britain, and in his newspaper he stated that Indians were justified in killing the British. "Swaraj, self-rule, is my birthright and I shall have it," he proclaimed. When the British partitioned the province of Bengal in 1905, making Bengali Hindus a minority group within the new divisions, the INC supported a boycott of British-made goods and government schools, and acts of anti-British terrorism occurred. Fearing a radical turn would harm their cause, INC President Gopal Krishna Gokhale and other moderate members called for the boycott to end when a new Secretary of State for India was appointed whom they believed was sympathetic. The Swadeshi movement calling upon Indians to purchase only Indian-made goods continued, however, led by the Indian lawyer and political activist Mohandas Gandhi. Tilak supported the Swadeshi movement, and in 1907 the INC split in two, with radicals aligning themselves with Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal and Lala Lajpat Rai, figure 931. The photograph shows three men seated in chairs in front of a white house with shuttered doors. The man on the left wears a dark, long coat, pants, has a mustache, a white turban on his head, and holds a cane in one hand, a roll of papers in the other. The man in the middle wears a long white dhoti, has a mustache, a dark small cap, and holds a cane in one hand and a book in the other. The man on the right wears a dark coat and a large white cloth draped over his shoulder and covering his legs. He holds a book in his hand and wears glasses. Figure 931. Indian nationalists. Indian nationalist leaders Lala Lajpat Rai, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Bipin Chandra Pal, L2R, were allies in the fight for independence and were often referred to as Lal Bal Pal. Credit: Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai and Bipin Chandra Pal, by unknown /Wikimedia Commons, public domain.